glasses clinking filled the grand ballroom at the Riverside Country Club in Connecticut, their crystalline notes mixing with the elegant string quartet that played softly near the altar decorated with white roses and baby's breath. Approximately 150 guests mingled in designer clothing, their conversations a low hum of congratulations and well wishes. "Call 911. Someone call 911 right now." The panicked voice cut through the celebration like a knife through silk. Sarah Martinez, 42 years old and 8 months pregnant with her first viable pregnancy in 5 years, lay unconscious on the polished marble floor. Her carefully styled dark hair had come loose from its elegant updo, spreading around her pale face like spilled ink. The navy blue maternity dress she had chosen specifically for what she believed was a close family friend's wedding reception was now wrinkled beneath her designer handbag scattered beside her along with its contents. Through the crowd of panicked wedding guests, a man in an expensive charcoal gray suit pushed forward with obvious reluctance. David Martinez, her millionaire husband of 20 years and the CEO of Martinez Construction Empire, knelt beside her with an expression that seemed more annoyed than genuinely concerned for his wife's well-being. She's pregnant with my child," David stammered to the arriving paramedics, his usual corporate executive confidence nowhere to be found. His hands trembled slightly as he loosened his silk tie, and perspiration beaded on his forehead, despite the air-conditioned comfort of the ballroom. From across the elegantly appointed room, near the elaborate wedding cake decorated with cascading sugar flowers, a young woman in a flowing white wedding dress shrieked in a voice that carried the unmistakable accent of Southern California. "This is supposed to be our day. Why is she even here? You promised me she wouldn't find out until we were already on our honeymoon." The paramedic who responded to the emergency call was Dr. Richard Williams, a seasoned emergency medical responder with 23 years of experience and graying temples that spoke to his extensive work in crisis situations. He had learned over the years to recognize when something wasn't quite right about a domestic situation, and every instinct he possessed was currently sending up red flags about this particular emergency call. "Ma'am, can you hear me? You're safe now. My name is Dr. Williams, and I'm here to help you," he said in the calm, professional tone that had comforted thousands of patients over his career. Sarah's eyelids fluttered open slowly, confusion clouding her brown eyes as she tried to focus on the face above her. The fog that had been affecting her thinking for months seemed thicker than usual, making it difficult to process her surroundings or understand how she had ended up on the floor of what appeared to be an unfamiliar venue. "David, what is this place? I thought we were going to the Thompson wedding at Sacred Heart Church. This doesn't look like Sacred Heart at all. Where are we, Dr. Williams exchanged a meaningful glance with his partner, EMT Jennifer Rodriguez, who was checking Sarah's vital signs with practiced efficiency. In his 2 decades of emergency response work, Dr. Williams had developed an ability to read situations that went far beyond medical symptoms, and something about this entire scenario felt wrong. "Ma'am, you collapsed at a wedding ceremony here at the Riverside Country Club, but you seem quite disoriented about your location and the circumstances. We're going to transport you to Hartford Hospital immediately to make sure both you and your baby are safe and healthy." As Sarah was carefully lifted onto the stretcher and prepared for transport, she caught a glimpse through her peripheral vision of David arguing intensely with the young bride near the elaborate floral arrangements that decorated the reception area. Their body language spoke of intimate familiarity rather than casual acquaintance, and their heated whispered conversation suggested a relationship that went far deeper than employer and employee. "David, aren't you coming with me to the hospital?" Sarah called weakly from the stretcher, her voice barely audible over the continued murmur of concerned wedding guests. "I'll meet you there, sweetheart. I just need to handle a few things here first," he replied without making direct eye contact, his attention clearly focused on the crisis management required by Sarah's unexpected appearance at what was supposed to be his secret wedding ceremony. The bride, who appeared to be approximately 28 years old with professionally styled blonde hair and expertly applied makeup, stepped closer to David with obvious agitation. Her white dress was clearly expensive, probably costing more than most people's monthly salary, and her diamond jewelry caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. "You promised me she wouldn't find out about us until after our honeymoon in Costa Rica. How did she even know about this wedding? You told me you sent her to that other wedding across town." Sarah's world began spinning as the horrible reality started penetrating through the medication-induced fog that had been affecting her cognitive function for months. The white wedding dress, the intimate setting, the way David and this woman stood together with the comfortable familiarity of people who had been planning a life together. "Sir, are you planning to accompany your wife to the hospital?" Dr. Williams asked with pointed emphasis, his professional demeanor masking his growing suspicion about the domestic situation he was observing. "I said I'll meet her there shortly," David snapped with obvious irritation, then caught himself and attempted to soften his tone when he realized how his response sounded to the medical professionals and remaining wedding guests. "Please, just take good care of her. I'll be right behind the ambulance." As the ambulance doors slammed shut with a decisive metallic clang, Sarah felt a strange mixture of physical relief from the medical attention and emotional devastation from the dawning realization of what she had just witnessed. The medication-induced mental fog that had been plaguing her daily life for the past several months seemed to be lifting slightly, but the increased clarity brought with it a terrifying understanding of her true situation. Through the small rectangular window in the ambulance door, she watched David wrap his arms around the bride in what appeared to be a comforting embrace, holding her close as she cried into his shoulder. It was the same protective, soothing gesture he used to offer Sarah during the early years of their marriage, back when she still believed their 20-year relationship meant something substantial and lasting. Dr. Williams monitored her vital signs during the 15-minute ride to Hartford Hospital, noting her elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, and the slight tremor in her hands that suggested something beyond simple pregnancy-related fainting. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some important medical questions. Have you been feeling unusually tired or confused lately? Any significant memory problems or difficulty concentrating on simple tasks?" Sarah thought carefully about the past several months, trying to piece together the fragments of her recent experiences through the persistent mental haze. The constant fatigue that she had attributed to the challenges of pregnancy at her age, the way even simple household tasks seemed overwhelming and confusing, how she frequently lost track of conversations in the middle of sentences, and the increasing difficulty she had been experiencing with basic decision-making. "Yes, actually, I thought it was just pregnancy brain. You know, the kind of mental fogginess that many older mothers experience. But it's been getting progressively worse over the past few months. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a thick fog where nothing makes complete sense." "When would you say these symptoms first became noticeable?" "Maybe 3 or 4 months ago, around the time David started being so incredibly attentive about my prenatal vitamin regimen. He began bringing them to me every single morning with my breakfast, along with a large glass of orange juice. He said he wanted to make absolutely sure I didn't forget to take them in my condition." She paused, a chill running down her spine as the implications began to dawn on her. "He became almost obsessive about my nutrition and medication schedule." Dr. Williams made detailed notes on his tablet and radioed ahead to Hartford Hospital with information that would prove crucial to Sarah's treatment and the investigation that would follow. "Hartford emergency. This is Rescue 23 with an incoming pregnant female, 38 weeks gestation, collapse with possible altered mental status and suspected domestic situation. Requesting immediate toxicology screen, psychiatric consultation, and social worker involvement upon arrival." As the ambulance navigated through the late afternoon Connecticut traffic, weaving between cars with its emergency lights flashing, Sarah closed her eyes and attempted to piece together the fragmented memories from the past few months. The increasingly frequent business dinners that kept David away from home until late in the evening, sometimes not returning until after midnight. The way he had begun subtly discouraging her from driving anywhere alone, suggesting that her condition made it dangerous for her to be behind the wheel. The gradual but persistent suggestions that perhaps she should consider seeing a mental health professional about what he described as her increasing anxiety and irrational behavior. Most disturbing of all was her growing realization that she had absolutely no memory of receiving a wedding invitation for any Thompson family celebration. In fact, the more she tried to remember how she had learned about today's supposed wedding ceremony, the more she realized that she couldn't recall any specific conversation, phone call, or written invitation that had informed her about the event. The ambulance pulled into Hartford Hospital's emergency bay with a smooth deceleration, and Sarah was immediately wheeled into Trauma Room 3, where a full medical team was waiting to assess her condition. As the nurses began drawing blood for comprehensive testing and the resident physician started her preliminary examination, she could hear Dr. Williams speaking quietly but urgently to the attending physician just outside the curtained area. Possible domestic abuse situation. Dr. Patterson, the husband didn't accompany his pregnant wife in the ambulance, seemed more concerned about damage control at the wedding venue than his wife's medical condition. Patient reports months of increasing confusion and memory problems. Something about her presentation and the circumstances just doesn't sit right with my experience. As Nurse Thompson drew multiple vials of blood for what Sarah would later learn was an extensive toxicology screening, Sarah stared at the fluorescent lights humming overhead and wondered how many other warning signs she had missed. Explained away, or simply accepted without question over the past months and possibly years. How many times had she ignored that persistent inner voice telling her something was wrong before finally realizing she should have trusted her instincts all along? How many red flags had she systematically dismissed because she desperately wanted to continue believing in the fairy tale version of love and marriage that she had been living for 2 decades? The medical team worked with quiet efficiency around her, checking fetal heart tones, monitoring her blood pressure, and preparing for what Dr. Williams had already suspected would be a complex case involving more than simple pregnancy complications. For the first time in months, despite her physical discomfort and emotional confusion, Sarah felt a small spark of genuine alertness cutting through the persistent mental fog. Whatever was about to unfold in the coming hours, whatever devastating truths were about to emerge from the medical tests and investigation, she sensed intuitively that her old life was ending. The life where she had been the devoted, trusting wife of a successful millionaire husband, living in their beautiful Westport mansion and looking forward to raising their child together, was dissolving around her like sugar in rain. And despite the overwhelming fear and uncertainty about what lay ahead, despite not knowing how she would possibly navigate the challenges that seemed to be approaching, a small but growing part of her felt something she hadn't experienced in months: relief. Relief that the confusion might finally have an explanation. Relief that her instincts about something being terribly wrong hadn't been the product of pregnancy-induced paranoia. And relief that whatever happened next, at least she would finally know the truth about what had been happening to her life, her mind, and her marriage. 3 hours earlier, Sarah had been standing in the nursery of their 6-bedroom Westport mansion, carefully folding tiny baby clothes with the kind of reverent attention that women who have experienced pregnancy loss bring to preparing for a new child. The room was painted in soft butter yellow, a gender-neutral choice for the surprise they had decided to wait to discover, with white furniture that David had insisted on purchasing from the most expensive baby boutique in Greenwich. She paused in her folding to look out the large bay window that offered a panoramic view of their impeccably manicured grounds. The estate sprawled across 3 acres of prime Connecticut real estate, complete with a swimming pool, tennis court, and gardens that required a full-time landscaping crew to maintain. 22 years ago, when she first met David Martinez at the age of 20, she never could have imagined living in such opulent luxury. Sarah had been fresh from college then, armed with a degree in English literature from Connecticut College and dreams of becoming a published novelist. The temporary secretarial position at Martinez Construction had been intended as nothing more than a way to pay her student loans and cover basic living expenses while she worked on her writing in the evenings and weekends. David had been 35 at the time, already established as the CEO of what he claimed was his family's 3rd-generation construction empire. He presented himself as charming, successful, and most importantly to her young and somewhat naive self, genuinely interested in her thoughts, dreams, and intellectual aspirations. Their courtship had been conducted like something from a romantic movie, filled with expensive dinners at the finest restaurants in Hartford and New Haven, weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, and the kind of lavish attention that made Sarah feel like the most important woman in the world. "Sarah, you're far too intelligent and talented to waste away in some corporate cubicle, typing other people's correspondence and filing their documents," he had told her over dinner at the exclusive Riverside Yacht Club, the same venue where they would eventually hold their wedding reception. "Let me take care of all the practical concerns about money and security. You can focus entirely on your writing, pursue your artistic dreams without worrying about mundane things like rent and grocery bills." It had seemed like the perfect fairy tale proposal to her 22-year-old self. A successful, established man offering to support her creative ambitions while providing a level of financial security that would allow her to focus entirely on her art. And for the first several years of their marriage, it had indeed felt like living in a fairy tale. Sarah had set up a beautiful writing office in their first home, a charming colonial in West Hartford, complete with built-in bookshelves, an antique oak desk, and large windows that looked out over a garden she had planted with her own hands. But somehow, between hosting David's business associates for elaborate dinner parties, managing their increasingly complex social calendar filled with charity galas and country club events, and maintaining the kind of household that David expected, her writing dreams had gradually faded into the background. The miscarriage 5 years ago had devastated them both, or so Sarah had believed at the time. They had been trying to conceive for several years, and when she finally became pregnant at 37, they had both been overjoyed. David had been supportive and attentive throughout the difficult recovery process, encouraging her to take time to heal both physically and emotionally. He had suggested therapy to help with the depression that followed the loss, had driven her to appointments, and had seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being. But looking back now with the clarity that was slowly returning, as whatever had been affecting her thinking began to wear off, Sarah found herself wondering if David's concern had been entirely genuine, or if he had been calculating and manipulating the situation even then, perhaps already planning for some future scenario where her mental health history could be used against her. This morning, as she had prepared for what she believed was the Thompson family wedding ceremony, David had been unusually solicitous and attentive, almost hovering around her as she got ready. She had overheard him speaking on his cell phone from his home office, his voice carrying the tone of someone coordinating important details. "Everything's set for 3 o'clock this afternoon. Make sure the photographers understand they need to stay completely away from the main church entrance. We can't have any pictures that might surface later." When Sarah had entered his office to ask about their departure time, he had quickly ended the phone call and turned to her with what she now realized had been a forced smile. "Honey, are you ready for the Thompson wedding? I have to say, I still think it's quite strange that they wanted such an unusually private ceremony. I don't even remember you mentioning meeting the Thompson family before, and I thought I knew all of our mutual friends and social connections." David's response had seemed evasive even at the time, though she had dismissed her concerns as pregnancy-related sensitivity. "They're just business associates. Sweetheart, nothing particularly fancy or social about it. You know how some people prefer very intimate gatherings rather than large celebrations?" Something in his tone and body language had made her feel uncomfortable, but she had attributed the feeling to the pregnancy hormones and general anxiety that came with approaching motherhood at the age of 42. "I've been thinking," David had continued, apparently eager to change the subject, "maybe after the baby arrives and you've had time to recover, we should take that extended trip to Europe we've been discussing. Just the three of us, spending a month or two traveling through France and Italy." "That sounds absolutely wonderful," Sarah had replied enthusiastically, though as she tried to recall the conversation, she couldn't actually remember any serious discussions about European travel, despite David's suggestion that they had been planning such a trip. As David's black Mercedes had pulled away from their circular driveway that morning, Sarah had stood in the doorway of their mansion, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, feeling an inexplicable sense of unease about the day ahead. "Something doesn't feel right today, little one," she had whispered to her unborn child, her voice barely audible in the quiet morning air. "Mommy's got a really bad feeling about what's going to happen." But she had dismissed the intuition as nothing more than pregnancy hormones, and the general anxiety that her doctor had assured her was completely normal for women experiencing pregnancy at her age. Dr. Patricia Wilson had explained that older mothers often experienced increased worry and stress, and David had been so understanding and supportive about her concerns, constantly reassuring her that everything would be fine. Now, lying in the hospital bed with intravenous fluid dripping steadily into her arm and medical monitors beeping softly around her, Sarah realized that what she had interpreted as David's understanding and support might have been something entirely different and far more sinister. The way David had started personally bringing her prenatal vitamins every morning, presenting them to her along with a large glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, and often staying to watch while she took them. the subtle but persistent suggestions that she might be developing pregnancy-related anxiety that could benefit from professional treatment, the gentle but continuous encouragement to limit her activities and social interactions, ostensibly for her own safety and the baby's health. Mrs. Martinez, a warm, professional voice interrupted her increasingly troubled thoughts. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Patterson, the attending emergency physician here at Hartford Hospital. How are you feeling right now? Dr. Patterson appeared to be a woman in her early 60s with kind but sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She spoke with a slight Boston accent that reminded Sarah of her favorite college professors, and her manner immediately put Sarah somewhat at ease despite the frightening circumstances. Honestly, I'm feeling confused and scared. Dr. Patterson, I'm not even completely sure how I knew about the wedding I attended today, and there's something about my husband's behavior that's been troubling me, though I can't quite put my finger on what exactly feels wrong. Let's start with some basic medical questions about your pregnancy. Sarah, have you experienced any complications during this pregnancy? How have you been feeling overall during the past several months? I've been incredibly tired, much more exhausted than I remember being during my previous pregnancy years ago. But I assume that was simply because I'm older now, and pregnancy is more physically demanding at 42. And I've been having significant problems with my memory and concentration. I've been losing track of conversations in the middle of sentences, forgetting appointments, having trouble following simple instructions. Dr. Patterson made detailed notes on her electronic tablet, her expression becoming increasingly serious as Sarah described her symptoms. When would you say these cognitive symptoms first became noticeable to you? Probably about 3 or 4 months ago, maybe a little longer. David noticed the changes too, and he became very concerned about my well-being. He started taking charge of making sure I took my prenatal vitamins every day, bringing them to me personally with breakfast. He said he wanted to ensure I didn't forget them due to my increasing forgetfulness. Dr. Patterson's expression grew more grave as she continued taking notes. Sarah, I need to ask you something very important, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Do you have a clear memory of what you had for breakfast this morning? The question seemed somewhat odd given the circumstances, but Sarah tried to focus her still foggy thinking on the morning's routine. David made scrambled eggs with cheese, the way he's been doing for the past few months. He brought me my prenatal vitamins along with a large glass of orange juice. He's been very attentive about my nutrition lately, always making sure I eat a substantial breakfast and take all my supplements. He says he wants to make sure I don't forget anything important in my current condition. Dr. Patterson leaned forward in her chair, her expression becoming much more serious and concerned. Sarah, I have the preliminary results from the blood work we conducted when you arrived, and I need to discuss some very concerning findings with you. The good news is that your baby appears to be healthy and your pregnancy is progressing normally. However, the toxicology screening has revealed some disturbing information about your blood chemistry. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she waited for Dr. Patterson to continue. We found significant levels of benzodiazepines in your system, specifically a medication called midazolam. This is a powerful sedative that's typically used in hospital settings for anxiety disorders and sedation before medical procedures. The levels we detected would require consistent, regular administration over a period of weeks or possibly months. The words hit Sarah like ice water. That's completely impossible. Dr. Patterson, I haven't been taking any anxiety medication or sedatives. David has suggested recently that I might benefit from seeing a psychiatrist about what he calls my increasing stress and irrational behavior. But I never actually saw a doctor or received any prescriptions for psychiatric medications. Sarah, the levels of midazolam in your blood indicate systematic, regular dosing over an extended period. This medication would need to be administered consistently, probably daily, and most likely by crushing tablets into food or beverages to mask the taste. The implications of Dr. Patterson's words crashed over Sarah like a tsunami of realization. The persistent mental fog, the confusion and memory problems, the way David had been so concerned about her apparent mental health issues lately, his suggestions that she might need professional psychiatric help. Her phone, which had been left in her purse during the collapse at the wedding, began ringing insistently from the bedside table. David's number flashed on the screen repeatedly, But before she could summon the strength to answer, she heard the distinctive sound of a voicemail notification. With trembling fingers that felt disconnected from her body, she accessed the message, expecting to hear David's voice expressing concern for her condition. Instead, she heard a young woman's voice, bright and excited and completely unfamiliar. "Baby, I can't believe we're actually married. I'm still wearing my wedding dress, and I keep staring at my ring. When are you finally going to tell that pathetic wife of yours about us? I'm getting really tired of pretending to be just your assistant when we're around other people. The honeymoon suite at the Marriott downtown is all ready for us, and I packed that sexy lingerie you bought me in Paris." Sononym. The voice was young, enthusiastic, and spoke with the kind of casual cruelty that comes from someone who has never experienced real consequences for their actions. But the words hit Sarah like physical blows, each sentence hammering home the devastating reality of her situation. Dr. Patterson, who had been observing Sarah's face carefully during the phone call, reached over and gently touched her arm. "Sarah, is there someone you trust that I can call to come be with you right now? A family member or close friend who could provide support while we work through this situation?" "My sister Monica," Sarah whispered, her mind still reeling from the voicemail message. "She lives in Manhattan, but she'll come. Monica works as a forensic accountant for a major firm, and she's always been somewhat suspicious of David, though she's mostly kept her opinions to herself over the years." As Dr. Patterson stepped out of the room to give Sarah privacy to call her sister, Sarah stared at the phone in her hands and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening to her life. 20 years of marriage, and she felt like she was learning about her husband for the first time. How long had David been systematically poisoning her, deliberately undermining her mental faculties while presenting himself as the concerned, caring husband? How long had he been planning whatever scheme required her to appear mentally unstable? But more terrifying than the betrayal and the poisoning was the dawning realization of what might have happened if she hadn't collapsed at that wedding ceremony. If David's plan had continued uninterrupted, if the systematic medication had continued for more weeks or months, how much worse could her condition have become? She thought about the beautiful nursery at home, painted yellow for the baby they had supposedly been planning together. She thought about the life insurance policies David had insisted they update recently, his suggestions that they needed to increase the coverage significantly due to their improved financial situation. She thought about the way he had been encouraging her to make him the sole beneficiary of her inheritance from her parents, explaining it as a practical matter of estate planning. 20 years of marriage, and Sarah was beginning to understand that she had never really known her millionaire husband at all. The successful construction executive, the devoted partner, the excited father-to-be, apparently all of it had been an elaborate performance designed to hide something much darker and more calculating. As she waited for Monica to make the drive up from New York City, Sarah stared at the ceiling and wondered how many other wives were living in similar situations right now, being systematically undermined and manipulated by narcissistic husbands who saw them as obstacles to be removed rather than partners to be cherished. For the first time in months, her mind felt clear enough to understand that she was fighting for more than just her marriage or her financial security. She was fighting for her sanity, her freedom, her child's future, and quite possibly her life itself. The sterile smell of hospital disinfectant mixed with the soft beeping of medical monitors filled Sarah's senses as she fully awakened in Hartford Hospital's emergency room several hours later. The persistent medication-induced fog that had been clouding her mind for months was lifting like morning mist, revealing a mental clarity that was both liberating and absolutely terrifying in its implications. Dr. Elizabeth Patterson returned to Sarah's bedside carrying a thick manila folder and wearing the grave expression of someone who had spent the past few hours uncovering evidence of systematic criminal activity. Her deliberate speech pattern and careful choice of words immediately commanded Sarah's complete attention. "Mrs. Martinez, we've completed your comprehensive blood work and toxicology screening, and I need to discuss some extremely concerning findings with you. These results, combined with what you've told me about your symptoms and your husband's behavior, paint a very disturbing picture." Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the hospital bed, her hand moving instinctively to protect her swollen belly, where her unborn child continued to develop despite the toxic environment that had been systematically created around them both. "Dr. Patterson, please tell me straight out, is my baby going to be okay? That's honestly all that matters to me right now. I'm happy to tell you that your baby appears to be healthy and your pregnancy is progressing completely normally. The fetal heart rate is strong. All the measurements are appropriate for your stage of pregnancy, and there don't appear to be any developmental issues or complications related to your exposure to the medication. Dr. Patterson pulled up a chair beside the hospital bed, settling in for what was clearly going to be a lengthy and serious conversation. However, Sarah, the toxicology results show dangerously high levels of midazolam in your system. This is a powerful benzodiazepine that's typically used in controlled medical settings for sedation and anxiety disorders. The levels we've detected indicate consistent, systematic administration over a period of several months, possibly longer. But doctor, I've told you repeatedly that I haven't been taking any anxiety medication or sedatives of any kind. Dr. Patterson opened her folder and pulled out several pages of laboratory results, pointing to specific numbers that meant nothing to Sarah, but clearly held significant meaning for the medical professional. Sarah, the concentration of this medication in your blood could only result from someone deliberately and regularly giving it to you without your knowledge. Someone would need to crush the tablets and mix them into your food or beverages on a daily basis for months to achieve these levels. The horrifying implications settled over Sarah like a suffocating blanket. The morning routine that David had established, bringing her prenatal vitamins personally along with freshly squeezed orange juice, his sudden concern about her nutrition, and his insistence on preparing her breakfast himself, his growing suggestions that she was developing pregnancy-related anxiety and might benefit from psychiatric treatment. Dr. Patterson, what exactly would this medication do to someone who was receiving it without their knowledge and without medical supervision? At therapeutic doses administered by a physician for legitimate medical reasons, midazolam is used to treat severe anxiety and panic disorders. However, when given at higher doses or administered regularly to someone who doesn't need it medically, it can cause significant cognitive impairment, memory problems, confusion, disorientation, and fatigue. Dr. Patterson flipped to another page in the folder, showing Sarah charts that track the typical effects of benzodiazepine abuse. In cases of systematic poisoning, like what you've experienced, the victim often appears to be suffering from mental health issues. Someone observing from the outside might conclude that the person was having a psychological breakdown, experiencing paranoid delusions, or developing serious psychiatric problems. Sarah felt physically sick as the pieces of David's plan began falling into place with devastating clarity. So someone could use this medication to make it appear that a person was mentally unstable, even if they were completely healthy before the poisoning began. Unfortunately, that's exactly correct. If someone wanted to discredit another person's mental competency or create evidence of psychiatric instability, systematic benzodiazepine poisoning would be an effective method. The phone in Sarah's purse rang again with David's distinctive ringtone. This time she answered, determined to hear what explanation he might offer for his absence from the hospital, where his pregnant wife was being treated for a medical emergency. Sarah, thank God you're awake and feeling better. I'm so incredibly sorry I couldn't come with you in the ambulance earlier. There was an urgent business situation at the wedding that I absolutely had to handle before I could leave. What kind of urgent business situation? David, what could possibly have been more important than accompanying your pregnant wife to the hospital? There was a significant pause on David's end of the line, and Sarah could hear muffled voices in the background, including what sounded like the young woman from the voicemail message. Sarah, honey, you're probably still feeling confused and disoriented from fainting earlier. The doctors probably gave you some medication that's affecting your thinking. You should just rest and try not to process too much information right now. The condescending, patronizing tone in David's voice triggered a cascade of memories about how many times he had spoken to her exactly that way over the past several months. How frequently he had dismissed her concerns, questioned her perceptions, or suggested that her reactions to situations weren't reliable or rational. I'm not confused or disoriented. David, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. I heard the woman in the wedding dress call you by name. I saw how intimately familiar you two were with each other. And I received a very interesting voicemail message on my phone. Another pause. Longer this time. And Sarah could almost hear David's mind racing as he tried to calculate how much she might know and how he could continue to manipulate the situation. Sarah, please, sweetheart, You're letting your imagination create problems that don't exist. This is exactly the kind of irrational thinking that's been concerning me about your mental state lately. You're seeing conspiracies and romantic relationships where there are just normal business interactions. Dr. Patterson, who had been listening to Sarah's side of the conversation with growing alarm, gently reached over and took the phone from Sarah's trembling hand. Mr. Martinez, this is Dr. Patterson, your wife's attending physician here at Hartford Hospital. I need to speak with you immediately about Sarah's test results. There are some extremely serious medical findings that we need to discuss in person. Sarah could hear David's voice through the phone speaker, but couldn't make out his exact words. However, Dr. Patterson's facial expression grew increasingly stern and disapproving as the conversation continued. Mr. Martinez, your wife has been systematically poisoned with benzodiazepines over a period of several months. This is a serious criminal matter that we're required to report to law enforcement authorities immediately. I strongly suggest that you come to the hospital right now to discuss this situation. When Dr. Patterson ended the phone call, Sarah was trembling with a combination of fear, anger, and something that felt almost like relief at finally understanding what had been happening to her mind and body. He's been deliberately drugging me, hasn't he? Doctor. All those mornings when he was so concerned about my prenatal vitamins, when he made sure I ate a proper breakfast and took all my supplements, he was systematically poisoning me while pretending to be the caring, attentive husband. Sarah, based on the medical evidence and what you've described about your husband's behavior, that appears to be exactly what has been happening. But I need to ask you some additional questions that may be difficult to answer. Dr. Patterson pulled out a new section of her folder, this one containing forms and questionnaires that Sarah recognized as the kind of documentation used in domestic abuse cases. Have you noticed any unusual changes in your husband's behavior over the past year? Any discussions about finances, insurance policies, or your mental health? Any suggestions about limiting your activities or social interactions? The questions opened up a floodgate of disturbing memories that Sarah had previously dismissed or rationalized away. David's insistence on increasing their life insurance policies substantially about 6 months earlier, claiming it was necessary because of the baby and their improved financial situation. His growing suggestions that she should see a mental health professional about what he characterized as her increasing anxiety and irrational behavior. His subtle but persistent discouragement of her maintaining friendships and social connections, always framed as concern for her health and safety during the pregnancy. Dr. Patterson, he's been gradually isolating me and undermining my confidence in my own perceptions for months. And now that I think about it clearly, he's also been taking control of all our financial affairs, telling me that I shouldn't worry about money matters while I'm pregnant and that he would handle everything. Sarah, what you're describing is a classic pattern of systematic domestic abuse designed specifically to undermine a victim's mental competency and social support system. Have you noticed any missing money or unusual financial activity? I honestly don't know. David has been handling all our finances for years, but recently he's been even more secretive about money matters. He says I don't have a head for numbers and that it's easier if everything goes through his office. Dr. Patterson exchanged a meaningful look with someone who had just entered the room, a woman in her 50s with kind but intelligent eyes and a professional but warm demeanor. Sarah, this is Patricia Wells. She's a social worker here at the hospital who specializes in domestic abuse cases. I asked her to join our conversation because what you're experiencing goes far beyond medical treatment. Patricia Wells pulled up another chair and spoke in a voice that managed to be both gentle and authoritative at the same time. Sarah, what you've described to Dr. Patterson represents a systematic pattern of psychological and physical abuse, specifically designed to undermine your mental competency and potentially gain control of your financial assets. This type of calculated abuse often escalates to life-threatening situations. You mean David might actually be trying to kill me? Based on the evidence, it appears more likely that he's trying to have you declared mentally incompetent, possibly through an involuntary psychiatric commitment. With systematic poisoning creating symptoms that mimic serious mental illness, combined with isolation from support systems and control of financial resources, an abuser can build a compelling case for having their victim committed to a psychiatric facility. Sarah felt the room spinning around her as the full scope of David's potential plan began to emerge. But what about the baby? What would happen to my child if I were committed to a psychiatric hospital? If you were declared mentally incompetent, your husband would likely gain full custody of the child and complete control of your financial assets. Depending on how far his plan extended, he could potentially liquidate everything and disappear while you were institutionalized and unable to defend yourself. The phone buzzed again with a text message from an unfamiliar number, but when Sarah opened it, the content made her blood run cold. The wedding ceremony was absolutely beautiful, even with the unexpected drama. Sorry your wife crashed our special day, but I can't wait for our honeymoon in Costa Rica next week. I'm already packed and ready for our new life together. Love and excitement, Mrs. Jessica Martinez. Sarah showed the text message to Dr. Patterson and Patricia Wells, watching their expressions grow more grave as they read the evidence of David's secret marriage and planned disappearance to a country with limited extradition treaties. Ladies, I think we're looking at something much more serious than domestic abuse, Patricia said quietly. This appears to be a systematic plan to steal Sarah's identity, assets, and child while potentially leaving her permanently institutionalized or worse. Dr. Patterson stood up with obvious determination. Sarah, we're going to keep you here at the hospital for continued observation while the medication clears completely from your system. But more importantly, we're going to help you figure out exactly what your husband has been planning and make sure you and your baby are protected. As if summoned by their conversation, they could hear David's voice echoing from the hospital corridor, speaking in the authoritative tone he used when he expected immediate compliance with his demands. Excuse me, I'm looking for my wife, Sarah Martinez. She was brought here by ambulance earlier today, and I need to see her immediately. I'm her husband and I have medical power of attorney. Patricia Wells stood up with a grim smile. Actually, Mr. Martinez, I don't think you do have medical power of attorney anymore. And after what we've discovered about your systematic poisoning of your wife, I think you're going to find that your legal situation has changed dramatically. Sarah looked up at the two women who had literally saved her life by recognizing the signs of systematic abuse that she had been too confused and manipulated to identify herself. What happens now? She asked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. Now, Dr. Patterson said firmly, we protect you and your baby, and we make sure your husband faces the consequences of what he's done. For the first time in months, Sarah felt like she was thinking clearly enough to understand that she wasn't just fighting for her marriage or her financial security. She was fighting for her freedom, her sanity, her child's future, and quite possibly her life itself. And with these women standing beside her, she was beginning to believe that she might actually win. While Sarah lay in that hospital bed beginning to understand the true scope of her husband's betrayal, her sister Monica was about to uncover financial evidence that would shatter everything she thought she knew about David Martinez and his supposedly successful construction empire. Monica Rivera had always possessed the kind of sharp analytical mind that made her exceptionally successful as a forensic accountant for one of Manhattan's most prestigious financial investigation firms. At 45 years old, she spoke with a slight New York accent she had acquired during her 15 years living in the city, and she had developed the habit of thinking out loud when working through complex financial puzzles, a trait that had served her well in exposing corporate fraud and embezzlement schemes. When she received Sarah's panicked phone call from Hartford Hospital, Monica immediately knew that her long-standing suspicions about David Martinez were about to be validated in the worst possible way. She had never trusted her brother-in-law, finding his charm too polished, his success story too convenient, and his treatment of Sarah too controlling. Though she had kept most of her concerns to herself over the years to preserve family harmony, Monica made the drive from her Manhattan apartment to Hartford in record time. Her silver BMW cutting through traffic while her mind raced through possibilities, and her hands-free phone system allowed her to make several crucial calls to contacts in law enforcement and financial investigation. Sarah, honey, I came as fast as I possibly could, Monica announced as she burst into the hospital room with her laptop bag slung over her shoulder and an expression of fierce determination on her face. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun that revealed her hasty departure from her office, and she still wore the expensive business suit that had been appropriate for her morning meetings with federal prosecutors. Monica, thank God you're here. I think David has been systematically drugging me for months, and there's evidence that he's been married to his assistant. I don't know what's real anymore. Monica's expression darkened as she listened to Sarah recount the events of the day, from the collapse at the secret wedding ceremony to Dr. Patterson's discovery of benzodiazepines in Sarah's blood. When Sarah played the voicemail message from Jessica, Monica's hands clenched into fists and her voice took on the cold, analytical tone she used when building cases against financial criminals. "That narcissistic son of a bitch," Monica muttered, then caught herself and apologized for her language. "Sorry, Sarah, but this is exactly the kind of systematic abuse I was worried about all these years. I should have pushed harder when I noticed red flags about his behavior and business practices." Dr. Patterson and Patricia Wells briefed Monica on the medical findings and their legal implications, explaining the systematic nature of the poisoning and the evidence suggesting a comprehensive plan to undermine Sarah's mental competency. Dr. Patterson, in your professional opinion, how long would someone need to plan something this elaborate? This level of manipulation and systematic abuse doesn't happen overnight. Based on the medication levels in Sarah's system and the symptoms she's described, I would estimate this has been going on for at least 3 to 4 months, possibly longer. The systematic nature suggests months of advanced planning. Fortunately, Monica opened her laptop and began connecting to secure servers that would allow her to access the kind of financial databases and investigation tools that weren't available to the general public. "Sarah, I need you to give me access to any financial information you can remember. Bank account numbers, investment accounts, insurance policies, anything that might help me trace what David has been doing with your money." "Monica, I don't have passwords or access to any of our financial accounts. David always said I didn't have a head for numbers and that it would be easier if everything went through his office. He's been handling all our finances for years, but recently he's been even more secretive about money matters." Monica's expression grew grim as she recognized another classic pattern of financial abuse. "Sarah, you have a college degree in English literature. You're perfectly capable of understanding financial matters. When someone tells you that you're too stupid to manage money, that's usually because they're stealing it." While Sarah rested, Monica began her forensic investigation using every resource available to her through her professional connections and her years of experience in tracking hidden assets and fraudulent financial activity. "Let me see what your millionaire husband has really been doing with your family's money," Monica said, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed databases that most people didn't even know existed. What Monica discovered in the first hour of investigation made her stomach turn, and her professional instincts scream warnings about the scope of David's criminal activity. "Sarah, you need to wake up and see this immediately. What I've found is much worse than simple adultery or even systematic poisoning." Sarah stirred as Monica pulled up bank statements and financial records on her laptop screen, the evidence of David's crimes displayed in neat columns of numbers that told a devastating story. "Honey, David has been systematically transferring large amounts of money out of your joint accounts and moving it to locations where you can't access it. Look at these withdrawal patterns." The bank statements showed a consistent pattern of transfers over the past 18 months, $50,000 here, $75,000 there, always in amounts just under the thresholds that would trigger automatic bank notifications or require additional authorization. "Where is all that money going?" "Monica, that's what I've been trying to trace, and what I'm finding is absolutely criminal." Monica clicked to another screen showing property records and rental agreements. "Sarah, David has been paying rent on a luxury apartment in Stamford, Connecticut. The lease shows a payment of $60,000, paid 6 months in advance. An apartment? Why would David need a separate apartment when we have the house in Westport?" Monica's voice was grim as she continued clicking through financial records. "I think we both know why he needed a private apartment, but let me show you what else I've discovered." Over the next 2 hours, Monica systematically uncovered a financial trail that painted a picture of comprehensive fraud and systematic deception that went far beyond simple marital infidelity. A joint bank account with Jessica Palmer that had been established 14 months ago and had been receiving monthly transfers of $25,000 from David and Sarah's marital assets. Life insurance policies on Sarah that had been increased to $5 million just 6 months earlier, with David listed as the sole beneficiary and Jessica Palmer listed as the secondary beneficiary in case something happened to David. Medical consultations with 3 different psychiatrists over the past 4 months, where David had discussed his concerns about his wife's declining mental health and increasingly erratic behavior, and had inquired about procedures for involuntary psychiatric commitments. Pharmaceutical records showing David's purchase of unmarked benzodiazepines from an unlicensed online source, with shipping records indicating regular monthly deliveries to a post office box registered under a false name. Monica, this is impossible. David built Martinez Construction from his father's company. We've been wealthy for years. How could he need to steal money when he's already a millionaire? Monica's face was pale as she turned her laptop screen towards Sarah, displaying financial records that would destroy everything Sarah believed about her husband's success and their family's financial security. Sarah, I've been digging deep into Martinez Construction's financial records using my professional access to corporate databases. David hasn't been building wealth, he's been systematically stealing it. The construction company is completely bankrupt and has been operating as a Ponzi scheme for at least 2 years. That can't be right. His father started that company decades ago, and David has built it into one of the most successful construction firms in Connecticut. No, sweetheart, I've traced the corporate records back to their origins. David's father's original construction company went bankrupt 22 years ago, right around the time you and David got married. David essentially stole the company name and reputation to create his own criminal enterprise, built on borrowed money and fraudulent contracts. The room seemed to spin around Sarah as she tried to process this information. Everything she had believed about their life, their financial security, and David's professional success had been built on lies and criminal activity. Patricia Wells returned with Detective Amanda Rodriguez from the Hartford Police Department, a stern-looking woman in her early 40s who specialized in financial crimes and domestic abuse cases. Mrs. Martinez, I understand your sister has uncovered some concerning financial activity that may be related to your husband's systematic poisoning. Can you walk me through what you've discovered? Monica turned her laptop toward Detective Rodriguez and began presenting her findings with the professional competence that had made her one of the most respected forensic accountants in the Northeast. Detective, what we're looking at here is a systematic financial fraud operation that includes embezzlement from employee pension funds, insurance fraud, and what appears to be a comprehensive plan to murder Sarah or have her permanently institutionalized while stealing her assets and custody of her child. Those are serious accusations. What evidence supports your conclusions? Monica pulled up a complex spreadsheet that tracked money flows between multiple accounts and business entities. David Martinez has been operating what's known as a shell game construction fraud. He would bid on municipal projects, collect advance payments from cities and towns, then use that money to pay off debts from previous projects while never actually completing the work he was contracted to perform. Detective Rodriguez studied the financial records with obvious professional interest. How long has this been going on? Based on what I can trace, at least 2 years, possibly longer. But it gets much worse. David has been stealing money from his construction company's employee pension fund to support his personal lifestyle and finance his relationship with Jessica Palmer. How much money are we talking about? Monica's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she delivered the devastating news. Detective, David Martinez has stolen approximately $4.7 million from pension funds that belong to working families who trusted him with their retirement security. We're talking about over 200 families whose life savings have been systematically stolen to finance David's affair and his plan to escape prosecution. Sarah began crying, but these weren't tears of sadness for her failed marriage. They were tears of rage and guilt about the innocent families who had been victimized by her husband's criminal enterprise. 200 families. Monica, all those people trusted David with their retirement money, and he stole it to finance his affair with a woman young enough to be his daughter. Sarah, this is absolutely not your fault, Detective Rodriguez said firmly. Your husband is a sophisticated financial criminal who spent years perfecting his ability to manipulate and deceive people. The fact that he fooled you doesn't make you complicit in his crimes against others. Monica closed her laptop and sat on the edge of Sarah's hospital bed, taking her sister's hand in a gesture of support and solidarity. Sarah, I know this is overwhelming and heartbreaking, but you need to understand something crucial. You're not a victim anymore. You're a survivor, and you have the power and the evidence to make sure David pays for what he's done to you and to all those families. Detective Rodriguez stood up, her expression showing the kind of determination that came from years of pursuing financial criminals who preyed on working families. Mrs. Martinez, based on the evidence your sister has uncovered, we have sufficient grounds to arrest your husband on multiple felony charges, including aggravated assault through systematic poisoning, financial fraud, embezzlement from employee pension funds, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The question is whether you're prepared to testify against him and help us build a case that will put him in prison for decades. Sarah looked around the room at the women who had rallied to support her sister who had uncovered the financial crimes, the doctor who had discovered the poisoning, the social worker who had identified the patterns of systematic abuse, and the detective who was prepared to pursue criminal charges that would protect other families from becoming victims. For the first time in months, Sarah's mind felt clear enough to understand that this wasn't just about her personal situation anymore. David's criminal enterprise had victimized hundreds of people, and she might be the only person in a position to stop him from continuing to destroy lives. Detective Rodriguez, I'll do whatever it takes to make sure David can never hurt another woman or steal another family's retirement savings. Those people trusted him, just like I did, and they deserve justice. Monica smiled through her tears. Sarah, your narcissistic ex-husband is about to learn something important about the women in our family. We don't stay victims, and we don't let criminals get away with destroying innocent people's lives. As if summoned by their conversation, they could hear David's voice in the hospital corridor, speaking in the entitled, demanding tone he used when he expected immediate compliance from people he considered beneath him. I want to see my wife immediately. I don't care what hospital policies say about visiting hours. I'm David Martinez, and I have every right to see Sarah. Detective Rodriguez smiled grimly as she reached for her handcuffs. Mr. Martinez is about to discover that his days of demanding special treatment are over. Sarah felt a surge of strength and determination that she hadn't experienced in years. Let's finish this. Meanwhile, 20 miles away at the Riverside Country Club, Jessica Palmer was experiencing her own crisis of conscience as the reality of her situation began to penetrate through the fairy tale fantasy she had constructed around her relationship with David Martinez. Jessica, who had moved to Connecticut from Los Angeles 2 years earlier for what she believed was a promising career opportunity as an executive assistant to a successful construction company CEO, was 28 years old with the kind of polished appearance that came from expensive salon treatments and designer clothing that she couldn't actually afford on her legitimate salary. She spoke quickly with the vocal fry that was characteristic of her generation, especially when she was nervous or trying to appear sophisticated, and her ambitious nature had always significantly outpaced both her common sense and her understanding of the potential consequences of her choices. Still wearing the elaborate white wedding dress that had cost more than most people's monthly salary, Jessica paced frantically around the country club's private office while speaking on her cell phone to her mother in California. Mom, I think I might have made a really huge mistake here, she said, her voice trembling with the first hints of genuine fear about what she had gotten herself involved in. The wedding ceremony was supposed to be absolutely perfect, just like something from a romantic movie. But David's wife showed up unexpectedly and collapsed right in the middle of everything, and now the whole situation feels completely wrong. From outside the office door, Carmen Lopez crouched quietly with professional-grade digital recording equipment, her 20 years of private investigation experience having taught her that people often revealed the most incriminating information when they believed they were having completely private conversations. Carmen spoke with a subtle Spanish accent and had developed the habit of whispering serious observations to herself in her native language when she encountered particularly disturbing criminal activity. Monica had contacted her that morning from her car while driving to Hartford Hospital, hiring her immediately to investigate the domestic situation and gather evidence that could be used in criminal proceedings. Dios mío, Carmen whispered to herself as she adjusted the sensitive recording equipment. This little fool is about to confess to everything David planned. Through the office door, Jessica's increasingly frantic phone conversation with her mother continued to reveal crucial details about the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed Sarah's life. No, Mom, you don't understand the situation at all. David promised me that Sarah would never find out about our relationship until after we got back from our honeymoon in Costa Rica. He said he had everything planned perfectly so that she would never be able to cause problems for us. Carmen raised her eyebrows as she listened to evidence of premeditation and careful planning that went far beyond simple adultery. A honeymoon destination in Costa Rica, a country with limited extradition treaties with the United States, suggested that this wasn't just about ending a marriage, but about fleeing criminal prosecution. I know the whole thing sounds bad when you put it like that, Mom, but David explained everything to me in a way that made sense at the time. He told me that Sarah has been having really serious mental health problems ever since her miscarriage 5 years ago, and that she's becoming increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous to herself and the baby. The office door opened suddenly, and David entered with his face flushed with anger and obvious anxiety about how much damage Sarah's unexpected appearance at the wedding might have caused to his carefully constructed plans. Jessica, get off the phone with your mother immediately. We have much more important things to discuss right now than your family drama. Mom, I have to go, Jessica said quickly, ending the call and turning to face David with an expression that combined guilt, fear, and growing suspicion about what she had gotten herself involved in. Carmen pressed closer to the door, her recording equipment capturing every word of what would prove to be a crucial conversation that would provide law enforcement with direct evidence of conspiracy and premeditated criminal activity. David, what exactly is happening here? Why did Sarah show up at our wedding when you told me she thought she was going to some other family's ceremony across town? You promised me that she wouldn't find out about us until we were safely in Costa Rica. David's voice carried the tight stress of someone whose carefully planned criminal scheme was falling apart around him. She wasn't supposed to figure out the real location of our wedding ceremony. You said you sent her information about the Thompson family wedding at Sacred Heart Church, not here at the country club. How was I supposed to know she would somehow end up at the correct venue? I did exactly what you told me to do. I sent her a fake invitation with the wrong address and the wrong time. How could I have known that she would figure out where we were really getting married? Carmen smiled grimly as she recorded evidence that Jessica had been actively involved in the deception rather than being an innocent victim of David's manipulation. This completely ruins everything we've been planning for months, David continued, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. We needed at least 3 more weeks of the medication regimen before we could move to the next phase of the plan. Before what? David, what exactly were you planning to do to Sarah after 3 more weeks of giving her those pills? There was a long, dangerous pause, and Carmen held her breath as she waited for David's response to Jessica's direct question about his criminal intentions. Not killed. Jessica, Jesus Christ, what kind of monster do you think I am? The plan was to make her appear unstable enough for an involuntary psychiatric commitment. With her documented history of postpartum depression following the miscarriage 5 years ago, it would be completely believable that the stress of pregnancy at her age had triggered a serious mental health crisis. But David, what about the baby? What would happen to Sarah's child if she was committed to a psychiatric hospital? The baby would be born while Sarah was institutionalized and receiving psychiatric treatment. As the father, I would automatically have full custody rights, especially with Sarah declared mentally incompetent by medical professionals. We could take the child with us to Costa Rica and start our new life together with complete financial security. Carmen felt her blood run cold as she listened to David calmly describe his plan to kidnap Sarah's child while leaving her permanently institutionalized and separated from her baby. David, I'm getting really scared about this whole situation. What if someone figures out what we've been doing to Sarah? What if the doctors at the hospital discover the medication in her system? No one is going to figure out anything. Jessica, Sarah has been taking those crushed benzodiazepines and her prenatal vitamins for 4 months now. Even if she stops taking them today, her recent medical history will show a clear pattern of increasing mental instability and irrational behavior. Any psychiatrist who evaluates her will confirm that she's unfit to care for a child. What about the construction company and all our financial plans? You keep telling me that we'll have enough money to live comfortably in Costa Rica. But what if something goes wrong with the business? David's laugh was cold and completely without humor. The construction company doesn't matter anymore. Jessica, I've already moved all the liquid assets to offshore accounts in countries that don't cooperate with American law enforcement. The pension funds, the investor money, everything is safely hidden where no one can touch it. Jessica was quiet for several seconds, and Carmen could sense that the young woman was beginning to understand the full scope of what she had gotten involved in. David, when you say pension funds, You mean the retirement money that belongs to your employees, right? The savings that working families are counting on for their financial security when they get older? It's just numbers on computer spreadsheets. Jessica, those people made the choice to trust their retirement savings to a company, and that's always a risk in business. They'll probably get their money back eventually from insurance or government programs. But what if they don't? What about all the families who are depending on that money? What about people who can't afford to lose their life savings? For the first time since Carmen had been listening to their conversation, David's voice turned genuinely cold and threatening in a way that made Jessica take a step backward. Jessica, you're my wife now, and that means your loyalty belongs to me and to our future together, not to a bunch of construction workers and their families. Those people chose to trust their money to my company, and business investments always carry risks. That's not my problem or your concern. The casual cruelty in David's voice made Carmen's skin crawl. In her 20 years of investigating domestic abuse cases, she had heard many unfaithful husbands and financial criminals. But the callous indifference David showed toward the families whose retirement savings he had stolen was particularly disturbing. What happens now? David, what are we supposed to do if Sarah starts telling people about what she saw at the wedding? We stick to the original plan and accelerate the timeline. Sarah is in the hospital right now, probably being sedated further by the doctors who think she's having pregnancy-related psychological problems. Her sister Monica can't prove anything, and even if she tries to make accusations, Sarah's documented medical history will support our version of events. David, what if Sarah starts remembering things more clearly once the medication wears off? What if she figures out that you've been drugging her? Who's going to believe a woman with a documented history of mental instability and postpartum depression over her successful millionaire husband and his concerned new wife? We have medical records, psychiatric evaluations, financial documents, everything we need to prove that Sarah was becoming increasingly unstable and potentially dangerous to herself and her unborn child. Carmen had heard enough to provide law enforcement with comprehensive evidence of conspiracy, financial fraud, systematic poisoning, and planned kidnapping. She carefully made her way back to her car and immediately called both Monica and Detective Rodriguez. Monica, this is Carmen. I have recorded evidence of everything you need to destroy David Martinez completely. And I mean absolutely everything: the poisoning, the financial fraud, the planned psychiatric commitment, even his admission about stealing pension funds from working families. As she drove back toward Hartford Hospital, Carmen reflected on the case and the systematic nature of David's criminal enterprise. She had investigated many cases involving financial abuse and domestic violence, but the calculated cruelty of David's plan was extraordinary, even by her professional standards. Every woman knows that moment when you realize you've been seeing someone through rose-colored glasses, she said to herself in Spanish as she navigated Connecticut traffic. When the mask finally slips completely off, and you wonder how you missed all the warning signs that were right there in front of you the entire time. But Sarah Martinez was about to discover something that many women never learned in their lifetimes. Sometimes the worst betrayal and the most devastating crisis becomes the catalyst for the greatest personal transformation and empowerment. And sometimes, when women start supporting women and working together to fight back against narcissistic abusers, they become an unstoppable force for justice. Carmen smiled as she dialed Detective Rodriguez's direct number. David Martinez was about to learn what happened when he underestimated the power of women who refused to remain victims and who were willing to fight for justice, not just for themselves, but for all the other families he had victimized with his criminal enterprise. The recorded confession she had captured would provide law enforcement with everything they needed to ensure that David Martinez spent the next 2 decades in federal prison, and that the families whose retirement savings he had stolen would get their money back. Justice, Carmen reflected, sometimes came in the form of a narcissistic criminal's own arrogance and his assumption that women were too weak or too stupid to fight back effectively. David Martinez was about to discover just how wrong he had been about that assumption. Back at Hartford Hospital, Dr. Patterson returned to Sarah's room carrying updated toxicology results and wearing the expression of someone who had spent several hours consulting with specialists about the systematic poisoning case that was rapidly becoming the most complex domestic abuse investigation the hospital had handled in recent memory. Patricia Wells accompanied her with a thick file folder containing documentation that would prove crucial to the criminal prosecution. And both women carried themselves with the professional gravity that came from understanding they were dealing with a case that involved multiple felonies and potentially life-threatening criminal activity. Patricia's warm, motherly speaking style carried an undertone of barely controlled anger as she addressed Sarah, who was looking more alert and focused than she had in months as the benzodiazepines continued to clear from her system. Sarah, the evidence your sister Monica has uncovered, combined with Dr. Patterson's medical findings and the recorded confession that Carmen Lopez obtained, reveals a pattern of systematic abuse that represents one of the most calculated domestic violence cases I've encountered in 25 years of social work. Dr. Patterson pulled up a chair beside Sarah's hospital bed and opened her medical folder to reveal charts and graphs that track the systematic poisoning over time. The good news, Sarah, is that the medication is clearing from your system more rapidly than we initially expected. Your mental clarity should continue to improve dramatically over the next 24 to 48 hours. The troubling news is what we're learning about the scope and duration of what's been done to you. Monica burst back into the hospital room carrying her laptop and several additional folders of financial documentation. Her face flushed with the kind of righteous anger that came from spending hours uncovering evidence of systematic fraud against working families. Sarah, it's much worse than we initially discovered. Carmen just called with recorded evidence from David's conversation with Jessica at the country club. And I've uncovered additional financial crimes that show this conspiracy goes back much further than we thought. Detective Rodriguez followed Monica into the room, accompanied by FBI Special Agent Robert Torres, a methodical federal investigator in his early 50s who specialized in white-collar financial crimes and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had built countless airtight criminal cases. Monica opened her laptop and began pulling up the financial documentation that would prove crucial to both the criminal prosecution and the recovery of stolen assets. Sarah, honey, your millionaire husband has been systematically stealing not just from your personal accounts, but from the pension funds of over 200 working families whose retirement security depended on the money they invested with Martinez Construction. 200 families. Sarah felt physically sick at the scope of David's criminal enterprise. All those people trusted him with their life savings, and he stole their money to finance his affair with Jessica. Agent Torres pulled up a chair and opened his own folder containing federal investigation documents that painted a comprehensive picture of David's criminal activities. Mrs. Martinez, the FBI has been investigating your husband's construction company for the past 8 months as part of a broader investigation into municipal contract fraud in Connecticut. What we've discovered, combined with the evidence your sister and the private investigator have gathered, shows that David Martinez has been operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that has victimized not just individual families, but multiple municipalities and government agencies. Agent Torres spread financial documents across the hospital room's table, creating a visual representation of the money trail that David had created to hide his criminal activities. Mrs. Martinez, your husband has been operating what we call a shell game, construction fraud, for approximately 3 years. He would submit bids for municipal infrastructure projects, collect substantial advance payments from cities and towns, then use that money to pay off debts from previous incomplete projects while never actually performing the contracted work. Agent Torres, when did you first become suspicious of David's business practices? The city of Bridgeport contacted the FBI 6 months ago when Martinez Construction failed to complete a $3.2 million water treatment facility project that was supposed to provide clean drinking water for low-income neighborhoods. When we began investigating the missing funds, we discovered similar failed projects in New Haven, Waterbury, Stamford, and several smaller Connecticut towns. Sarah stared at the documents spread before her, trying to comprehend how the man she had been married to for 20 years could have been systematically defrauding municipal governments and stealing money that was intended to provide essential services to communities. So David's entire construction empire was built on stolen money and fraudulent contracts. Not entirely fraudulent, but built on a foundation of borrowed money and systematic fraud. Agent Torres replied, your husband's father did own a legitimate construction company decades ago, but that business went bankrupt 21 years ago, almost immediately after your marriage. David essentially stole the company name, reputation, and client relationships to create his own criminal enterprise. Monica pulled up additional financial records on her laptop screen. Her forensic accounting expertise, allowing her to trace money flows that would be invisible to most investigators. Sarah, the systematic poisoning and the secret marriage to Jessica represent David's planned escape strategy from federal prosecution. When the FBI investigation started closing in on his financial crimes, he accelerated his timeline for disappearing with the stolen money. Agent Torres nodded as he reviewed Monica's financial analysis. Mrs. Martinez, we believe your husband realized approximately 6 months ago that federal investigators were getting close to exposing his construction fraud. The systematic poisoning, the increased life insurance policies, the offshore bank accounts, all of this represents his plan to liquidate remaining assets and flee the country before he could be arrested. Patricia Wells consulted her notes about the domestic abuse patterns they had identified. Agent Torres, what would have happened to Sarah if David's plan had succeeded completely? Based on the evidence, we believe Mr. Martinez intended to have Mrs. Martinez committed to a long-term psychiatric facility while he gained custody of their child and liquidated all remaining marital assets. The offshore accounts we've traced contain approximately $4.9 million that was stolen from various sources over the past 2 years. $4.9 million. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the scope of the criminal enterprise her husband had been operating while she believed they were living a normal, successful life. Monica clicked to another screen showing the comprehensive financial damage David's crimes had caused to innocent families throughout Connecticut. Sarah, David didn't just steal money from government contracts and employee pension funds. He also defrauded private investors who trusted him with their savings, elderly clients who hired Martinez Construction for home renovation projects, and even charitable organizations that paid him advance fees for construction work that was never completed. Dr. Patterson had been reviewing the medical records that documented David's systematic poisoning campaign against Sarah. Agent Torres, the medical evidence shows that Mr. Martinez had been planning this psychiatric commitment strategy for months. He consulted with multiple psychiatrists about having Sarah institutionalized, and he was building a medical paper trail to support his claims about her mental instability. What kind of medical paper trail? Sarah asked, dreading the answer. David told psychiatrists that you were having violent mood swings, paranoid delusions about his business activities, and irrational fears about financial security. He was creating documentation that would support an involuntary commitment based on claims that you were becoming dangerous to yourself and your unborn child. Agent Torres pulled out recordings that Carmen had made of David's conversation with Jessica at the country club. Mrs. Martinez, we have recorded evidence of your husband admitting to the systematic poisoning, the planned psychiatric commitment, and his intention to flee to Costa Rica with your child and the stolen money. As Agent Torres played portions of the recording, Sarah heard David's voice coldly describing his plan to destroy her life while stealing the retirement savings of working families who had trusted him. Those people chose to trust their money to a company. That's their risk to take, David's recorded voice said, referring to the pension fund theft with complete indifference to the human impact of his crimes. Sarah began to cry, but these weren't tears of sadness or self-pity. They were tears of rage at the casual cruelty David had shown toward innocent people, and determination to make sure he faced consequences for the systematic harm he had caused to so many families. Agent Torres, what happens to all the families whose money David stole? Will they ever get their retirement savings back? The FBI has been working with Treasury Department specialists to trace and freeze David's offshore accounts. We've recovered approximately $4.2 million so far, which represents most of the stolen pension funds. The Employee Retirement Income Security Act provides federal protections for pension beneficiaries, so the affected families will receive their full retirement benefits even if we can't recover every stolen dollar. Monica leaned forward, her expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal fury. Sarah, there's something else you need to know about the scope of David's planning. I found evidence that he's been systematically undermining your credibility with friends and social connections for over a year. What do you mean? I called several people from your social circle this afternoon, claiming I was concerned about your well-being. David has been telling people for months that you've been having serious mental health issues, that you've been making irrational accusations about his business, and that he's been trying to get you professional help. Agent Torres nodded grimly. It's a classic isolation strategy used by sophisticated abusers. By preemptively discrediting the victim's potential testimony, The perpetrator creates a situation where no one believes the victim even when they try to report the abuse. Patricia Wells consulted her case notes. Sarah, this explains why you felt so confused and isolated during the past few months. David wasn't just poisoning your body with medication. He was systematically destroying your social support network and your reputation in the community. Dr. Patterson stood up with obvious determination. Sarah, we're going to keep you here for continued medical observation until we're certain all traces of the benzodiazepines have cleared your system. But more importantly, we're going to make sure you have comprehensive legal protection before you leave this hospital. Carmen Lopez appeared in the doorway, her digital recorder in hand and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had just delivered decisive evidence in a major criminal case. Ladies and gentlemen, I have David Martinez's complete confession to systematic poisoning, financial fraud, planned kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. His conversation with Jessica Palmer at the country club provided evidence of premeditation, criminal intent, and detailed knowledge of his criminal activities. She played several key excerpts from the recording for Agent Torres, who took detailed notes as David's own words provided federal prosecutors with everything they would need for multiple felony convictions. We needed at least 3 more weeks of the medication before we could have her committed, David's voice said through the recorder's speaker. The baby would be born while Sarah was institutionalized. As the father, I would have full custody rights, especially with Sarah declared mentally incompetent. Agent Torres smiled grimly as he listened to David describing his criminal plan in detail. Mrs. Martinez, your husband has just provided us with evidence of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, systematic poisoning, insurance fraud, and multiple federal financial crimes. This recording, combined with the financial evidence and medical documentation, represents one of the strongest criminal cases I've worked on in 15 years with the FBI. Monica closed her laptop and sat on the edge of Sarah's hospital bed, taking her sister's hand in a gesture of support and sisterly solidarity. Sarah, I know this is completely overwhelming and heartbreaking, but you need to understand something important about your situation. You're not a victim anymore. You're a survivor with the evidence and the legal support necessary to make sure David pays for what he's done to you and to all those innocent families. Detective Rodriguez, who had been coordinating with hospital security, returned to the room with an update about David's current location. Agent Torres, David Martinez is currently in the hospital lobby demanding to see his wife and claiming that he has medical power of attorney over her treatment decisions. He's becoming increasingly agitated and making threats about what will happen to staff members who don't comply with his demands. Agent Torres stood up, reaching for the handcuffs attached to his belt. Perfect timing. Mrs. Martinez, are you prepared to see your husband arrested for the crimes he's committed against you and against the families whose retirement savings he stole? Sarah looked around the room at the women and law enforcement professionals who had literally saved her life by recognizing the systematic abuse and gathering the evidence needed to stop David's criminal enterprise. Her sister Monica, who had uncovered the financial crimes and traced the stolen money. Dr. Patterson, who had identified the systematic poisoning and provided crucial medical evidence. Patricia Wells, who had recognized the patterns of domestic abuse and connected Sarah with legal resources. Carmen Lopez, who had risked her safety to record David's confession. Detective Rodriguez and Agent Torres, who were prepared to ensure that David faced federal prosecution for his crimes. For the first time in months, Sarah felt strong enough and clear-minded enough to understand that this moment represented far more than just the end of her marriage. This was her opportunity to protect other families from being victimized by David's criminal activities, and to send a message that systematic abuse of women would face serious legal consequences. Agent Torres, I'm ready to see David arrested for what he's done. But more than that, I want to make sure that every family whose retirement money he stole gets their savings back. And I want other women to know that systematic abuse can be stopped when we have the courage to fight back. Monica squeezed Sarah's hand. Sarah, your narcissistic ex-husband spent months thinking he was the smartest person in every room, believing he could systematically destroy your life and steal millions of dollars from working families without facing any consequences. Carmen smiled as she packed up her recording equipment. He made one crucial mistake, though. He underestimated what happens when women start supporting women and working together to fight back against financial abuse. Patricia Wells gathered her case files with obvious satisfaction. Sarah, your courage in fighting back against David's systematic abuse is going to help other women recognize the warning signs and seek help before their situations become life-threatening. As they prepared to witness David's arrest, Sarah reflected on the transformation she had undergone in less than 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been a confused, systematically poisoned woman living in fear and isolation, believing that her mental health problems were causing her marriage to deteriorate. Today, she was a federal witness in a major financial crimes investigation, surrounded by professional women who had worked together to expose a criminal enterprise and protect innocent families from further victimization. The fog of systematic abuse was lifting, revealing not just the scope of David's crimes, but Sarah's own strength and intelligence that had been suppressed but never destroyed by months of psychological and chemical manipulation. Let's go watch my husband get arrested for systematic poisoning, financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. For the first time since her collapse at the wedding, Sarah felt like she was in control of her own life and destiny. 2 days later, Sarah sat in the prestigious law offices of Henderson and Associates in downtown Hartford, her hands steady and her mind clearer than it had been in over a year. The last traces of benzodiazepines had finally cleared from her system completely, bringing with it a mental acuity and emotional strength that surprised even her healthcare providers. Margaret Henderson, the 62-year-old senior partner, spoke with the precise diction and unwavering confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades prosecuting white-collar criminals and had developed a particular expertise in cases involving systematic domestic abuse combined with financial fraud. Her silver hair was pulled back in a conservative bun that conveyed professional authority, but her eyes held the passionate fire of someone who genuinely despised financial predators who targeted vulnerable women and working families. Mrs. Martinez, your case represents one of the most systematically calculated examples of domestic financial abuse that I've encountered in 32 years of legal practice. Your husband didn't simply commit adultery or even basic financial fraud. He orchestrated a multi-year criminal campaign specifically designed to steal your identity, your child, your assets, and ultimately, your life itself. James Liu, Margaret's partner who specialized in complex family law cases involving significant assets and criminal activity, reviewed the comprehensive evidence that Carmen Lopez had gathered over the past several days. He spoke with the quiet authority that came from handling the most complicated divorce and custody cases in Connecticut. Sarah, the recordings that Carmen obtained are completely admissible as evidence under Connecticut law. Since our state requires only one-party consent for recordings, and Carmen was conducting a legitimate investigation into suspected criminal activity, David's detailed confession will be devastatingly effective in both criminal and civil proceedings. Monica sat beside Sarah with her laptop open to financial spreadsheets that detailed every aspect of David's criminal enterprise, from the initial pension fund thefts to the systematic transfer of marital assets to offshore accounts controlled by David and Jessica. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division has now officially taken over the investigation, Monica announced with obvious professional satisfaction. When federal agents started tracing David's money trail, they discovered that his criminal activities affected far more people than we initially realized. Margaret leaned forward, consulting her notes about the federal investigation that had been rapidly expanding as law enforcement agencies uncovered additional evidence of David's systematic fraud. Sarah, Agent Torres contacted me this morning with an update about the scope of the federal charges that David will be facing. The systematic poisoning and domestic abuse are just the beginning of his legal problems. A knock on the conference room door interrupted their discussion. Detective Rodriguez entered with FBI Agent Torres and a woman Sarah didn't recognize, a federal prosecutor in her 40s, with the kind of serious demeanor that suggested extensive experience with major white-collar criminal cases. Mrs. Martinez, this is Assistant United States Attorney Lisa Williams from the District of Connecticut, Agent Torres announced. She'll be prosecuting the federal charges against your husband, and she wanted to speak with you personally about the scope of the criminal case. Prosecutor Williams opened a thick briefcase and spread documents across the conference table, creating a visual representation of what appeared to be one of the most comprehensive white-collar criminal cases in recent Connecticut history. Mrs. Martinez, I want you to understand the significance of what your courage has accomplished. Your willingness to come forward as a witness has allowed us to build a federal case that will protect hundreds of other potential victims from your husband's criminal activities. Agent Torres consulted his investigation notes. Sarah, when we started tracing the money your husband stole from pension funds, we discovered that Martinez Construction was just one component of a much larger criminal enterprise. David has been operating fraudulent construction companies under different names in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. Different companies. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the expanding scope of David's criminal activities. How many families have been affected by his fraud? Prosecutor Williams pulled out a summary document that outlined the full extent of the federal investigation. Mrs. Martinez, we've now identified over 400 families whose retirement savings were stolen by your husband's criminal enterprise over the past 4 years. The total amount of stolen money exceeds $8 million. Sarah felt physically sick as she tried to comprehend the human impact of David's systematic theft from working families who had trusted him with their most precious asset, their financial security for retirement and old age. $8 million, 400 families. How could David have been operating such a massive criminal enterprise while I lived in the same house with him? Monica reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand supportively. Sarah, sophisticated financial criminals are experts at compartmentalizing their activities and maintaining separate identities for different aspects of their lives. David's ability to deceive you doesn't reflect any failure on your part. It demonstrates how skilled he became at systematic deception. Agent Torres nodded in agreement. Mrs. Martinez, we've investigated numerous cases of criminal enterprise operated by individuals who maintained completely normal family lives while simultaneously running multi-million-dollar fraud operations. Your husband's ability to hide his criminal activities actually demonstrates the sophisticated nature of his criminal planning. Margaret Henderson reviewed the federal charging documents that Prosecutor Williams had prepared. Sarah, the federal government is prepared to bring charges that include wire fraud, money laundering, theft from employee pension funds, systematic poisoning, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and insurance fraud. David is looking at a minimum of 25 years in federal prison, potentially much longer. What about Jessica Palmer? Will she face criminal charges for her role in the conspiracy? Prosecutor Williams consulted her notes about Jessica's involvement in David's criminal activities. Ms. Palmer has agreed to cooperate fully with the federal investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. She'll plead guilty to conspiracy charges and will receive approximately 3 years of federal probation plus community service. Carmen Lopez, who had been quietly observing the legal proceedings, spoke up with obvious satisfaction about the progress of the criminal case. Sarah, Jessica's cooperation has been crucial in understanding the full scope of David's planning. She's provided evidence about his plans to flee to Costa Rica, his systematic poisoning campaign against you, and his detailed knowledge of the pension fund thefts. Detective Rodriguez received a radio message and looked up with a grim smile. Agent Torres, we have confirmation that David Martinez is currently at his office building, apparently attempting to destroy financial records and computer files that contain evidence of his criminal activities. Agent Torres stood up immediately, reaching for his federal arrest warrant. Perfect timing. Destroying evidence is another federal crime that we can add to the charges. Margaret Henderson gathered her legal documents with obvious anticipation. Sarah, would you be willing to assist in your husband's arrest? We'd like him to believe he's meeting you for a reconciliation discussion, while federal agents are positioned to take him into custody. Sarah felt a surge of personal power and determination that she hadn't experienced in years. For months, she had been systematically manipulated, controlled, poisoned, and diminished by a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed from his path to wealth and freedom. Now she had the opportunity to turn the tables completely and ensure that David faced justice not just for what he had done to her, but for what he had done to hundreds of innocent families whose only mistake had been trusting him with their financial security. Margaret, what exactly do you need me to do? 25 minutes later, Sarah stood in the elegant marble lobby of David's downtown Hartford office building, flanked by plainclothes federal agents and Detective Rodriguez. Her phone call to David had been carefully scripted. She needed to see him urgently to discuss their marriage and their future together as parents. David emerged from the elevator looking haggard and desperate, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled in a way that suggested he had been working frantically to cover up evidence of his criminal activities. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his normally perfect hair was messed, and perspiration stains were visible on his shirt despite the air-conditioned comfort of the professional office building. "Sarah, thank God you're here and you're feeling better. I've been incredibly worried about you since your collapse at the wedding. I should never have left you alone in the hospital while I was handling business matters." His performance was worthy of professional theater, but Sarah could see right through the manipulative charm that had once made her feel cherished and protected. The concerned husband act that had previously made her doubt her own perceptions now looked pathetic and transparently false. "David, we need to talk honestly about what happened at that wedding ceremony and about what's been happening in our marriage over the past several months." "Sarah, honey, you were confused and disoriented from pregnancy complications. The doctors at the hospital probably gave you medication that affected your thinking and made you imagine things that weren't really happening." The patronizing, condescending tone in David's voice was identical to the way he had been speaking to her for months, systematically undermining her confidence in her own perceptions and mental capabilities. "I wasn't confused or disoriented. David, I was being systematically poisoned by my husband of 20 years, who was secretly married to his 28-year-old assistant while planning to have me committed to a psychiatric hospital so he could steal my child and disappear to Costa Rica with millions of dollars in stolen money." David's face went completely pale as he realized that his carefully constructed web of lies had been thoroughly exposed, and that Sarah's mental fog had lifted enough for her to understand exactly what he had been planning. "Sarah, please, you're not thinking clearly. You're imagining conspiracies and criminal activities that don't exist. This is exactly the kind of irrational, paranoid thinking that's been concerning me about your mental health." Agent Torres stepped forward from behind a marble pillar, his FBI credentials clearly visible, and his federal arrest warrant in hand. "Mr. David Martinez, you're under arrest for federal wire fraud, money laundering, theft from employee pension funds, systematic poisoning, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Agent Torres read David his constitutional rights and applied federal handcuffs, David looked at Sarah with genuine panic and desperation for the first time in their 20-year relationship. "Sarah, please, you don't understand what you're doing here. Think about our child. Think about our life together. Do you really want your baby to grow up knowing that their father is in federal prison?" Sarah met David's eyes steadily, her voice carrying a strength and clarity that surprised even her with its power and conviction. "David, I want my child to grow up knowing that their mother was strong enough to protect them from a narcissistic father who saw them as nothing more than a commodity to be stolen and traded for financial gain. I want my child to understand that real love doesn't require you to lose yourself or accept systematic abuse." As the federal agents led David away in handcuffs, he made one final desperate attempt to manipulate Sarah's emotions and regain psychological control over the situation. "Sarah, after 20 years of marriage, after everything we built together, you're really going to destroy our family over some misunderstandings and business complications." Sarah's response was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who had finally understood the true nature of her situation and had found the strength to fight back effectively. "David, you destroyed our family when you decided to systematically poison your pregnant wife while stealing millions of dollars from working families who trusted you with their retirement security. I'm just making sure you face the consequences of your choices." As the elevator doors closed on David and the federal agents, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure and personal empowerment. The man who had controlled every aspect of her life for 2 decades, who had systematically undermined her mental health and stolen her sense of reality, was finally being held accountable for his criminal activities. Margaret Henderson put a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder as they watched the federal law enforcement convoy leave the office building. "Sarah, how do you feel right now?" Sarah looked out the large windows of the office lobby at the Hartford skyline, thinking about the hundreds of families who would get their retirement savings back and the other women who might be protected from similar systematic abuse because she had found the courage to fight back. "Margaret, for the first time in over a year, I feel completely free. Free from manipulation, free from fear, and free to build whatever kind of life I want for myself and my child. The transformation from victim to survivor to advocate was nearly complete, and Sarah was beginning to understand that her greatest challenges might actually become her greatest strengths. 6 hours later, Sarah sat in the sterile conference room of the FBI field office in Hartford, watching through a one-way mirror as Agent Torres methodically destroyed what remained of David's psychological defenses during what would prove to be a devastating federal interrogation. David had been provided with legal representation by Richard Blackstone, an expensive corporate defense attorney who specialized in white-collar criminal cases and had built his reputation defending wealthy executives accused of financial fraud. However, even Blackstone appeared overwhelmed by the comprehensive evidence that federal prosecutors had assembled against his client. Agent Torres spread financial documents, recorded conversations, medical records, and digital evidence across the interrogation table with the methodical patience of someone who had spent 15 years building airtight federal criminal cases against sophisticated white-collar criminals. Mr. Martinez, we've spent the past 48 hours tracing the complete money trail from your various fraudulent construction companies to offshore bank accounts in Costa Rica, the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and 3 other countries with limited extradition agreements with the United States. David's expensive attorney whispered urgently in his client's ear. But David seemed to have entered a psychological state of shock denial as the full scope of the federal investigation became clear. Those were legitimate business transactions and international investment strategies. Construction companies routinely maintain accounts in multiple countries to manage currency fluctuations and international contracting opportunities. Agent Torres pulled up digital banking records on his tablet computer, displaying transaction histories that told a devastating story of systematic theft and criminal money laundering. Mr. Martinez, these electronic transfers of stolen pension fund money occurred on the exact same dates that your construction company was supposed to begin work on municipal projects in Bridgeport, New Haven, and Waterbury. Instead of purchasing construction materials or paying worker salaries, you moved the money to personal accounts controlled by you and Jessica Palmer. Agent Torres clicked to another screen showing insurance documents and medical records that revealed the calculated nature of David's plan to destroy Sarah's life. This transfer of $250,000 to your Costa Rica account occurred on the same day you increased your wife's life insurance policy to $5 million. These psychiatric consultation reports show you inquiring about involuntary commitment procedures for Sarah just 72 hours after that insurance policy modification. David's composure began cracking as he realized that federal investigators had uncovered every aspect of his criminal planning with forensic precision. Those are completely unrelated financial and medical decisions. You're creating connections and conspiracies where none exist. Are we, Mr. Martinez? Because we have recorded evidence of you explicitly admitting to systematically poisoning your wife with benzodiazepines as part of a comprehensive plan to have her committed to a psychiatric facility while you gained custody of her child and liquidated her assets. Agent Torres pressed the play button on Carmen Lopez's digital recording device, and David's own voice filled the interrogation room with devastating clarity. We needed at least 3 more weeks of the medication before we could have her committed. David's recorded voice stated with chilling calculation. The baby would be born while Sarah was institutionalized. As the father, I would have full custody rights, especially with Sarah declared mentally incompetent by medical professionals. The color drained completely from David's face as he heard his own words providing federal prosecutors with direct evidence of premeditated conspiracy to commit kidnapping, systematic poisoning, and insurance fraud. That recording was obtained through illegal surveillance methods. Private investigators can't just record people's private conversations without proper legal authorization. Agent Torres consulted his legal notes with obvious satisfaction. Actually, Mr. Martinez, Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recording conversations. The private investigator who obtained this evidence was conducting a legitimate investigation into suspected criminal activity on behalf of your systematically abused wife. The recording is completely admissible under both state and federal law. Sarah watched from behind the one-way mirror as her husband of 20 years completely unraveled, his carefully constructed facade of respectability crumbling as federal agents exposed the criminal enterprise he had been operating while presenting himself as a successful family man. Agent Torres opened another file containing pharmaceutical records and medical evidence that documented the systematic poisoning campaign David had conducted against his pregnant wife. Let's discuss the systematic nature of your domestic abuse activities. Mr. Martinez, these pharmaceutical purchase records show you buying unmarked benzodiazepines from unlicensed internet sources over a period of 6 months, with shipping addresses that correspond to post office boxes registered under false names. David's attorney was frantically taking notes and whispering legal advice, but even experienced criminal defense counsel seemed to realize that the federal case was essentially unwinnable given the comprehensive evidence. Mr. Martinez, you wrote this email to Jessica Palmer, and I quote, "The medication regimen is working perfectly. Sarah is becoming increasingly confused and disoriented, exactly like we planned. Once she's committed to the psychiatric facility, I'll have complete power of attorney over all her financial assets, and we can liquidate everything before moving to Costa Rica with the baby." David buried his face in his hands as Agent Torres read his own written words back to him, providing additional evidence of premeditation and criminal conspiracy. "I was venting frustration about a difficult marriage situation. That email doesn't represent any actual criminal planning or real intentions to harm Sarah. Doesn't it, Mr. Martinez? Because these medical records show that you were systematically crushing benzodiazepine tablets and mixing them into your wife's prenatal vitamins on a daily basis for 4 months, the same medication that was found in dangerous concentrations in Sarah's bloodstream when she collapsed at your secret wedding ceremony." Agent Torres leaned forward across the interrogation table, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had successfully prosecuted dozens of similar criminal cases. "Mr. Martinez, you systematically poisoned your pregnant wife while stealing over $8 million from the retirement accounts of more than 400 working families. You planned to have your wife permanently institutionalized while kidnapping her child and fleeing to a non-extradition country with the stolen money. What exactly do you think you can offer federal prosecutors in exchange for any kind of plea agreement?" David looked up with the desperate expression of someone whose elaborate criminal scheme had been completely exposed and who was beginning to understand the scope of the federal charges he would be facing. "I can provide information about other people who were involved in the financial aspects of the construction company operations. Jessica Palmer helped facilitate some of the electronic transfers. My accountant, Robert Thompson, knew about several of the offshore accounts and helped structure some of the international transactions." Agent Torres made detailed notes while maintaining his professional demeanor. "Mr. Martinez, conspiracy to commit federal financial fraud is also a serious criminal offense. If you're admitting that other individuals helped you steal pension fund money from working families, you're actually providing us with evidence for additional federal prosecutions rather than helping your own legal situation." The interrogation continued for another 2 hours, with David alternating between desperate attempts at denial, pathetic efforts to minimize his criminal culpability, and increasingly frantic offers to provide information about other people in exchange for reduced federal charges. But Agent Torres had built a comprehensive federal case that closed off every possible avenue of escape or legal maneuvering that David's expensive criminal defense attorney might attempt to pursue. Finally, David's lawyer requested a private consultation with his client to discuss the possibility of accepting a federal plea agreement rather than proceeding to trial with overwhelming evidence of guilt. Agent Torres joined Sarah and her legal team in the observation room adjacent to the interrogation facility. "Mrs. Martinez, your husband is facing a minimum of 25 years in federal prison, with the possibility of additional time if he's convicted on all charges. The evidence we've assembled makes conviction essentially certain if the case proceeds to trial." Margaret Henderson reviewed her notes about the federal charges and the strength of the prosecution's case. "Agent Torres, what's the realistic likelihood of securing convictions on all the major federal charges? With the financial evidence, the recorded confessions, the medical documentation of systematic poisoning, and the testimony from cooperating witnesses, I would estimate our chances of conviction at approximately 99%. This is one of the strongest white-collar criminal cases I've worked on in 15 years with the Bureau." Sarah felt a profound sense of justice and closure as she watched federal law enforcement officers build an airtight case that would ensure David faced serious consequences for his systematic abuse of her and his theft from hundreds of working families. "Agent Torres, what happens to the families whose retirement money David stole? Will they be able to recover their life savings? The FBI has successfully frozen and recovered approximately $7.4 million from your husband's various offshore accounts. Combined with the liquidation of his domestic assets and insurance settlements, we expect to recover nearly all of the stolen pension funds. The affected families will get their retirement security back. Monica squeezed Sarah's hand supportively. Sarah, you've not only escaped from a systematically abusive marriage, you've also ensured that hundreds of innocent families will get their stolen money returned to them. Carmen Lopez, who had been observing the interrogation process, smiled with obvious satisfaction about the progress of the federal prosecution. Mija, your narcissistic ex-husband spent months believing he was the smartest person in every room, thinking he could systematically destroy your life and steal millions from working families without facing any serious consequences. Patricia Wells consulted her case files about domestic abuse patterns and legal outcomes. Sarah, your willingness to fight back against David's systematic abuse is going to help other women recognize the warning signs of financial and psychological manipulation before their situations become life-threatening. As they prepared to leave the federal building, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary transformation she had undergone in less than a week. From a confused, systematically poisoned victim who believed she was experiencing pregnancy-related mental health problems, to a federal witness in a major white-collar criminal case that would protect hundreds of families from financial fraud. Agent Torres, when will David's case go to trial? Given the strength of the evidence and the overwhelming nature of the charges, I expect his attorney will negotiate a federal plea agreement within the next few weeks. Your husband is looking at spending the next 2 decades in federal prison, and he'll probably accept a plea deal rather than risk even longer sentences if he's convicted at trial. Sarah looked through the conference room window at the Hartford skyline, thinking about the new life she would be building for herself and her unborn child, free from systematic abuse and manipulation. For 20 years, I believed David when he told me I wasn't smart enough to understand financial matters or strong enough to survive on my own. Today, I learned that I was intelligent enough to help federal agents build a criminal case that will protect hundreds of families and send a systematic abuser to prison for decades. Margaret Henderson gathered her legal documents with obvious professional satisfaction. Sarah, you've proven that women who find the courage to fight back against narcissistic abuse can achieve justice not just for themselves, but for all the other victims who were harmed by the same criminal. As they left the federal building, Sarah felt the kind of personal empowerment and clarity that she hadn't experienced in years. Her old life as the systematically manipulated wife of a millionaire husband was completely over, but her new life as a strong, independent woman was just beginning. The nightmare was ending, but Sarah's real story was just starting. 6 weeks later, Sarah held her healthy daughter in the bright, cheerful maternity ward of Hartford Hospital, the same medical facility where her journey from victim to survivor had begun when Dr. Patterson first discovered the benzodiazepines in her bloodstream and recognized the signs of systematic abuse. Isabella Marie Martinez had been born at exactly 39 weeks gestation, weighing 8 pounds and 4 ounces, with a head full of dark hair that reminded Sarah of David's genetic contribution, but with brown eyes and a determined expression that seemed to come entirely from Sarah's side of the family. As Sarah cradled her newborn daughter in the early morning sunlight that streamed through the hospital room windows, she felt a profound sense of completeness and emotional security that had nothing whatsoever to do with the man who had contributed half of Isabella's DNA. "Hello, my beautiful, perfect little girl," Sarah whispered as Isabella's tiny fingers wrapped around her mother's thumb with surprising strength. "You and I are going to build the most wonderful life together. Better than wonderful. Actually, we're going to be completely free and completely happy." Dr. Patterson entered the hospital room carrying Isabella's medical chart and wearing the warm, professional smile that had become familiar to Sarah over the weeks of prenatal care that had followed her liberation from David's systematic poisoning. "Sarah, Isabella is absolutely perfect in every possible way. Her APGAR scores were excellent at both 1 minute and 5 minutes after delivery. All her vital signs are strong and stable, and the pediatric examination didn't reveal any developmental issues or complications related to your exposure to the benzodiazepines during pregnancy. Dr. Patterson, I can't thank you enough for everything you did to save both our lives. If you hadn't recognized the signs of systematic poisoning and taken immediate action to get law enforcement involved." Dr. Patterson pulled up the comfortable chair that had become her usual spot during their conversations over the past month and a half. Sarah, you saved your own life by having the courage to trust your instincts and fight back when you finally understood what was happening to you. My role was just recognizing the medical evidence and connecting you with the right resources. Monica burst into the hospital room carrying an enormous bouquet of pink and white flowers, several gift bags from expensive baby boutiques, and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had spent the past 6 weeks systematically dismantling a financial criminal's remaining assets while building a new life for her sister and niece. How is my absolutely gorgeous niece doing this morning? And how is my sister, the federal witness who helped send her narcissistic ex-husband to prison for 22 years? 22 years, I thought the plea agreement was for 20 years. Monica set down her packages and pulled up another chair beside Sarah's hospital bed. David's attorney tried to negotiate additional reductions, but Agent Torres and Prosecutor Williams held firm. 22 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years. Plus, he has to pay full restitution to all the families whose pension money he stole. Margaret Henderson arrived with James Liu, both carrying legal documents and wearing the professional satisfaction that came from successfully protecting a client from systematic abuse while ensuring that a dangerous criminal faced appropriate consequences. Sarah, we have several pieces of excellent news to share with you, Margaret announced as she consulted her notes about the final legal settlements. First, the federal court has approved the complete asset forfeiture from David's criminal enterprise. Every penny of the stolen pension money has been recovered and returned to the affected families. That's wonderful news. What about our marital assets? I know David spent a lot of our legitimate money on his affair with Jessica. James Liu opened his legal folder and pulled out financial documents that detailed the final property settlement. Sarah, your situation is actually much better than we initially expected. The prenuptial agreement that David insisted on 20 years ago, ironically, works strongly in your favor now that the marriage is being dissolved due to his systematic criminal activity. How does a prenuptial agreement help my situation? Under Connecticut law, when a marriage ends due to criminal abuse including systematic poisoning, the victim is entitled to significant financial damages beyond the normal property division. You're also protected from any responsibility for David's criminal debts or legal obligations. Margaret consulted her own notes about the comprehensive financial settlement. In practical terms, Sarah, you're looking at approximately $9 million in total assets. This includes insurance settlements, damages for the systematic abuse, your rightful share of legitimate marital property, and additional compensation from the Federal Victims Fund. Sarah felt completely overwhelmed by the financial security that would allow her to build whatever kind of life she wanted for herself and Isabella. $9 million, I don't even know how to process that amount of money. Monica moved to sit on the edge of the hospital bed, careful not to disturb Isabella's peaceful sleep. Sarah, you've gone from being a systematically abused wife to being a financially independent woman in less than 2 months? Do you realize how incredible that transformation is? Carmen Lopez appeared in the hospital room doorway, carrying a small gift bag and wearing the warm, maternal expression that had replaced her usual professional investigator demeanor during the weeks she had spent helping Sarah rebuild her life. Mija, how are you feeling today? And how is this precious little princess who's going to grow up knowing that her mama is the strongest woman in Connecticut? Carmen, I still can't believe how much my life has changed since that day I collapsed at David's wedding. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in a completely different woman's life. Sarah, you're not living in someone else's life. You're finally living your own life for the first time in 20 years. David spent decades trying to convince you that you were weak and dependent, but really you were just temporarily suppressed by systematic abuse. Dr. Patterson checked Isabella's vital signs and feeding schedule while the conversation about Sarah's new life continued around them. Sarah, I need to ask you about your plans for the future. Have you given any thought to what you want to do with your newfound freedom and financial independence? Sarah looked around the hospital room at the women who had literally saved her life by recognizing the systematic abuse, gathering evidence of the criminal conspiracy, and supporting her through the federal prosecution that had brought David to justice. Her sister Monica, who had left her high-paying corporate job to help Sarah navigate the legal system and rebuild her financial security. Margaret Henderson, who had prosecuted David's criminal activities with relentless determination. Carmen Lopez, who had risked her personal safety to gather the recorded evidence that made David's conviction possible. Dr. Patterson, who had identified the systematic poisoning and provided crucial medical testimony. Patricia Wells, who had helped Sarah understand the patterns of abuse and connect with appropriate resources. Actually, I've been thinking about this for weeks, and I've decided I want to start a foundation dedicated to helping women who are trapped in financially abusive relationships. Most women don't have a forensic accountant for a sister or the financial resources to hire private investigators and experienced attorneys. But every woman deserves the chance to escape systematic abuse and rebuild her life with dignity and security. Margaret's eyes immediately lit up with professional interest and personal enthusiasm. Sarah, that's an absolutely brilliant idea. Financial abuse is one of the most underreported and misunderstood crimes in America, primarily because victims often don't recognize the warning signs or know how to gather evidence of systematic manipulation. I was thinking we could offer comprehensive services, free financial forensic investigations, legal assistance, medical support for victims of systematic poisoning, counseling services, and even temporary housing for women who need to disappear while building their cases against abusive husbands. Monica was already mentally organizing the practical aspects of Sarah's vision. I could leave my corporate consulting work entirely and run the financial investigation division full-time. We could call it the Isabella Foundation, named after this little angel who represents hope and new beginnings. Carmen nodded enthusiastically while gently stroking Isabella's tiny hand. And I would be honored to head up the security and private investigation services. There's nothing I'd rather do with the rest of my career than help women escape from narcissistic ex-husbands who think they can systematically destroy other people's lives. Patricia Wells, who had been quietly observing the planning conversation from the corner of the hospital room, stepped forward with obvious professional interest. Sarah, I would love to serve on your foundation's advisory board and help develop protocols for identifying and treating victims of systematic abuse. What you're describing could potentially help thousands of women recognize the warning signs before their situations become life-threatening. Dr. Patterson smiled as she finished her examination of Isabella. And I would be delighted to consult on the medical aspects of systematic abuse cases. The healthcare community desperately needs better training on recognizing the signs of deliberate poisoning and other forms of medical manipulation that abusers use to undermine their victims' credibility. Sarah felt tears of pure joy rather than sadness for the first time in over a year. So we're really going to do this. We're going to transform my nightmare experience into something that helps other women find their strength and escape from systematic abuse. Margaret gathered her legal documents with obvious determination and professional excitement. Sarah, we're not just going to help individual women, we're going to revolutionize how the legal system understands and prosecutes financial abuse cases. Your experience is going to become the template for recognizing and stopping systematic domestic abuse before it escalates to life-threatening situations. Isabella stirred in Sarah's arms, opening her eyes for one of the first times since her birth and looking directly at her mother with an expression of perfect trust, unconditional love, and what seemed like complete confidence in their shared future. What do you think? Isabella, should mommy spend her life helping other women find the strength to fight back against systematic abuse and build beautiful new lives for themselves and their children? As if responding to her mother's question, Isabella made a soft, contented sound and settled back into peaceful sleep, completely secure in Sarah's protective embrace and surrounded by women who would teach her that courage, determination, and sisterhood were the most valuable lessons any woman could learn. Sarah looked around the room at her chosen family, the women who had recognized her worth when she had forgotten it herself, who had fought for her freedom when she was too confused to fight for herself, and who had helped her transform from victim to survivor to advocate for other women facing similar challenges. You know what I've learned through this entire experience, Sarah said, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been in decades. People always say that when one door closes, another one opens. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes you have to walk through absolute fire to reach that new door. And sometimes the person you become on the other side of that fire is someone you never knew you had the strength to be. Isabella yawned contentedly and snuggled closer to her mother, completely secure in the knowledge that she was wanted, loved, and protected by a woman who had found her own strength by helping other women find theirs. For Sarah Martinez, what had initially seemed like the worst day of her life, collapsing at David's secret wedding, while 8 months pregnant, had actually become the first day of her real, authentic, powerful life. And with Isabella in her arms and her chosen family surrounding them both, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of the most meaningful chapter of her story. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the beautifully landscaped garden of her new home in the historic seaside town of Mystic, Connecticut, watching 18-month-old Isabella take her first confident steps across the soft grass while laughing with pure delight at her own accomplishment. The elegant colonial-style house overlooked the peaceful waters of Long Island Sound, and the gentle, rhythmic sound of waves against the rocky shoreline had become the perfect soundtrack for their new life together. Sarah had chosen this location specifically because it represented everything that her previous life in Westport had: not: authenticity, tranquility, and freedom from the artificial pressures of maintaining appearances for people whose approval had never actually mattered. "Come on, sweet girl. You can make it all the way to mommy," Sarah encouraged with genuine enthusiasm, her arms outstretched as Isabella toddled toward her with the determined concentration that had become her signature expression when facing new challenges. The past 12 months had been an extraordinary whirlwind of legal proceedings, foundation development, media interviews, and the pure joy of motherhood experienced without the constant shadow of systematic abuse and manipulation hanging over every moment of daily life. The Isabella Foundation had grown from an ambitious idea discussed in a hospital room to a fully operational nonprofit organization that was already helping women across New England escape from financially abusive relationships and rebuild their lives with dignity and security. Monica appeared on the wraparound porch of the house, carrying a birthday cake decorated with pink butterflies and wearing the kind of genuine happiness that came from work that felt more like a calling than a career. At 46, Monica looked healthier and more fulfilled than she had during her previous life as a corporate forensic accountant, and her decision to leave the high-pressure world of Manhattan financial consulting to help women escape systematic abuse had proven to be one of the best choices of her life. "Is my absolutely gorgeous niece ready for her first birthday celebration?" Monica called out as she set the cake on the outdoor dining table that had been decorated with pink and purple balloons, fresh flowers, and presents wrapped in cheerful paper. The garden was filled with guests who had become Sarah's true family over the past year, but these weren't the superficial country club acquaintances and business associates from her previous life with David. These were the women who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had chosen to stand with her, fight for her, and help her build something meaningful from the wreckage of systematic abuse. Carmen Lopez arrived through the garden gate with her teenage daughter, Maria, both carrying presents and wearing the kind of comfortable family clothing that reflected their genuine affection for Sarah and Isabella, rather than any need to impress other guests. Carmen had indeed left her private investigation practice to become the director of security services for the Isabella Foundation, and her daughter had become like a beloved niece to Sarah, often spending weekends at the Mystic House and helping with Isabella's care. "Mija, how is our precious little princess celebrating her first birthday?" Carmen asked in the mix of English and Spanish that had become natural in their extended family conversations. She swept Isabella up into a gentle hug, speaking to the toddler in rapid Spanish that made Isabella giggle and clap her hands with obvious delight. Dr. Patterson came through the garden with Patricia Wells, both now serving on the Foundation's medical and social work advisory boards, and both having become close personal friends rather than just professional colleagues over the months of working together to develop comprehensive protocols for identifying and treating abuse victims. "Sarah, the Foundation's first annual impact report makes for absolutely remarkable reading," Dr. Patterson announced as she settled into one of the comfortable outdoor chairs that had been arranged around the birthday celebration. "In our first full year of operation, we've successfully helped 87 women escape from financially abusive relationships and recover over $3 million in stolen assets." Patricia Wells smiled with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from work that made a genuine difference in people's lives. "And 23 of those women have gone on to help other victims by sharing their experiences and providing peer support. There's something incredibly powerful about survivors helping other survivors heal and rebuild." Margaret Henderson and James Liu arrived together, carrying legal documents that had become cause for celebration rather than stress, and wearing the professional pride that came from having helped create something that would protect women for generations to come. Sarah, we have some wonderful news to share, Margaret announced as she pulled out papers from her briefcase. The Connecticut state legislature has just passed comprehensive financial abuse legislation that's being called the Sarah Martinez Protection Act. It requires all healthcare providers, financial institutions, and law enforcement agencies to receive training on recognizing systematic abuse and providing appropriate resources to victims. They named legislation after me. Sarah felt genuinely honored by the recognition, but also somewhat overwhelmed by the idea that her personal nightmare had contributed to legal protections for other women. James Liu smiled as he explained the significance of the new legislation. Your case exposed critical gaps in how our society identifies and responds to systematic abuse. Now every doctor, nurse, paramedic, bank employee, and police officer in Connecticut will know the warning signs that Dr. Patterson recognized when you collapsed at David's wedding. As the birthday party guests gathered around the outdoor table, Sarah helped Isabella blow out her single candle, while the little girl clapped her hands and laughed with the kind of pure joy that comes from being completely loved and completely secure. Make a wish for mommy, sweetheart, Sarah whispered to Isabella, though she realized that she already had everything she could possibly want or need for a fulfilling and meaningful life. As the afternoon sun began casting longer shadows across the garden, and the celebration wound down into comfortable conversation among close friends, the guests began sharing stories about the year's accomplishments and the Foundation's growing impact on women throughout New England. The Isabella Foundation had expanded beyond Connecticut to include chapters in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. Sarah's story had been featured in national magazines and television programs, but always as an empowerment narrative about the power of women supporting women through crisis, rather than as a victim story that focused on the abuse itself. Sarah, I need to tell you something that I've been thinking about for months, Monica said as they cleaned up after the party, while Isabella played contentedly with her new toys on a blanket nearby. Do you remember when you used to say that David had saved you from being alone, and that you couldn't survive without his financial support? Sarah watched Isabella stack colorful blocks with intense concentration, her daughter completely secure in the knowledge that she was wanted, loved, and cherished for exactly who she was, rather than for what she could provide to someone else. I was never actually alone, Monica. I had just forgotten who I was underneath all those years of systematic manipulation and psychological abuse. David didn't save me from anything, he just temporarily convinced me that I needed to be saved instead of recognizing my own strength. Carmen, who was helping fold chairs and pack up decorations, overheard the conversation and joined in with her own observations about Sarah's transformation. You know what I've learned from working with your case and all the other women we've helped through the foundation, Mia. The strongest women are usually the ones who have been tested the most severely. David thought he was systematically breaking you down, but really he was just revealing how fundamentally unbreakable you actually were underneath all his manipulation. Dr. Patterson, who was carrying leftover cake to her car, paused to add her medical perspective to the conversation about resilience and recovery from systematic abuse. Sarah, I've been treating victims of domestic abuse for over 20 years, but I've never witnessed someone transform trauma into purpose and meaning the way you have. The Isabella Foundation isn't just helping individual women escape abuse, it's actually changing how our entire society understands and responds to financial manipulation and systematic psychological abuse. As the evening approached and the last guests prepared to leave, Sarah found herself alone in the garden with Isabella, who was getting sleepy after her exciting day of birthday celebrations and attention from her extended chosen family. You want to know a secret, my beautiful little girl? Sarah whispered to her daughter as they sat together on the garden swing, watching the sun set over Long Island Sound. Exactly 1 year ago today, Mommy thought her life was completely over when she collapsed at your biological father's secret wedding. But really, that was just the beginning of our real life together. Isabella yawned and snuggled closer to her mother, her complete trust and unconditional love serving as a daily reminder of what healthy relationships actually looked like when they were built on honesty, respect, and genuine care rather than manipulation and control. Sarah rocked gently on the swing while looking out over the peaceful water, reflecting on the extraordinary journey from victim to survivor to advocate that had brought them to this moment of complete contentment and security. The frightened, confused woman who had been systematically poisoned by her narcissistic ex-husband seemed like a completely different person now. Someone from a previous lifetime who had needed to be rescued so that the real Sarah could finally emerge and claim her authentic life. David was currently serving his 22-year federal sentence at a minimum security prison in Pennsylvania, and Jessica had completed her community service requirements and moved back to California to rebuild her own life. But Sarah rarely thought about either of them anymore, because her focus was entirely on the future Isabella's childhood, in a home filled with love and honesty. The foundation's continued expansion to help even more women, and her own ongoing healing and personal growth. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened, she said softly to Isabella, who had fallen asleep in her arms. I thought my life was ending when I collapsed at that wedding ceremony, but really it was just the beginning of everything that actually mattered. You and I aren't just survivors, Isabella. We're the authors of our own story now, and we get to write whatever kind of beautiful ending we want. The sound of Isabella's gentle breathing mixed with the rhythmic waves against the Connecticut shoreline as Sarah carried her daughter into their home, their sanctuary, and prepared for whatever adventures tomorrow might bring. She had learned through direct experience that midlife transformation wasn't just possible. It was incredibly powerful when approached with courage and determination. Financial independence after 50 wasn't just a hopeful dream. It was an achievable choice when women supported each other and refused to accept systematic abuse. And the phrase, women supporting women, wasn't just an inspiring slogan. It was the fundamental force that had literally saved her life and given her the opportunity to save other women's lives in return. As she tucked Isabella into her crib in the nursery that had been decorated with soft yellow paint and white furniture, colors chosen for joy rather than to hide the gender of a child who might be stolen, Sarah smiled at how dramatically everything had changed in just 18 months. She had gone from being the controlled, systematically abused wife of a millionaire husband who saw her as an obstacle to his criminal ambitions, to being an independent woman with a clear mission to help other women find their own strength and freedom. From victim to survivor to advocate to the leader of a movement that was changing how society understood and responded to systematic abuse. The best part of her transformation wasn't the $9 million in financial assets or the national recognition for the foundation's groundbreaking work. The best part was the knowledge that Isabella would grow up watching her mother choose courage over fear, action over victimhood, purpose over comfort, and authentic relationships over convenient ones. The gentle sound of waves against the mystic shoreline continued as Sarah stood in Isabella's nursery, looking down at her sleeping daughter and feeling profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had led them to this place of safety, love, and unlimited possibility. She had started this journey as a victim of systematic abuse, but she was ending it as the author of her own story and the architect of a new life built on her own terms, surrounded by women who had chosen to stand with her and help her transform tragedy into triumph. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help other women, and new adventures with Isabella. But tonight, Sarah Martinez was exactly where she belonged, free, strong, loved, and ready to write whatever came next in their beautiful story together. The nightmare was over. The real life had finally begun, and it was going to be extraordinary.